Chapter 18. Rachel York had kept rooms on the first floor of a neat little lodging house in Dorset Court, not far from Kat's own townhouse. But it was mid-afternoon by the time Kat was able to get rid of Lord Stoneleigh and make her way there. Already the light was fading from the day. As she climbed the long flight of stairs from the ground floor, a hard sleet began to fall, striking the window at the end of the wide hall like a flurry of small pebbles. "You won't find anyone there, I can tell you that," said a querulous female voice floating down from the second floor just as Kat raised her hand to knock. Crossing the hall, Kat stuck her head over the banister and looked up. "Excuse me." She found a small face, deeply wrinkled by time and surrounded by a halo of white hair, peering down at her from the gloom of the second floor. "She's dead, murdered in a church, God rest her soul." "Actually, it was her maid, Mary Grant, I was interested in seeing. I thought I might like to hire her, if she's in need of a new position." "Huh? She's long gone, that one. Cleaned the place out first thing this morning, she did." Kat was starting to get a crick in her neck. She shifted around to a more comfortable position. She could see the woman better now. So small she had to stand on tiptoe to rest her arms on the top of the upper banister. Her purple satin gown was of a style one might have seen in the previous century, although it looked new. Just like the ropes of pearls and emeralds and rubies draping her neck and thin wrists looked real, at least in this light and from this angle. "Cleaned it out." "Took everything," said the elderly woman, her inflection betraying lingering traces of a Highland accent. "Carried it right off. Easy enough to do, I suppose, seeing as how her mistress already had most everything packed." Rachel was moving to new lodgings? It was news to Kat. "Ah, leaving London, more like, if you ask me." "Leaving?" "That's what I thought, although she wasn't exactly what I'd call forthcoming, that girl. All a twitter this week she was, up in the trees one minute, scared of her shadow the next. She'd found some way to get her hands on some money, was what I thought." The old woman expelled her breath in a little Lot of good it did her, in the end. "But I thought there was a constable here. How could Mary Grant have taken anything without his knowing?" The old woman didn't seem to find Kat's interest in details in any way unusual. She gave another of her little "That one. He left at first light, he did, and good riddance to him, too. Let me tell you the number of people we've had tramping up and down these stairs. Why, it's worse than what it was when that girl was alive." "I suppose you have had the authorities here?" Kat allowed her voice to trail off encouragingly. "Aye, 3 times. At least I assume that's who they were. And then there was that young man who had a key." Kat felt a quickening of interest. A young man with a key? None of Rachel's men, as far as Kat knew, had been young, and Rachel never gave any of them keys. One of her cousins, I suppose. The elderly woman laughed, a ribald cackle that echoed eerily down the darkening stairwell. "One of her lovers, you mean? No need to pull your punches with me, young woman. I cut my eye teeth long ago." Kat smiled up at her. "Come here regularly, did he?" The woman sniffed. "Not him. Never seen him before." This time, Kat kept her smile to herself. She had no doubt the old woman kept a very, very close watch on the stairwell's comings and goings. "If you ask me," said the woman, "he was here looking for something he didn't find." "Really?" "Aye. Heard him down there a good 5 minutes, going from room to room, and I says to myself, he must be searching that place. And then what does he do but come up here and knock at my door bold as brass, wanting to know if I had any idea where that maid had taken herself off to. As if I would." The old woman fixed Cat with a speculative look. "You're an actress too, I suppose?" "Well," said Cat hastily, "if Mary Grant is indeed gone, then I suppose I'm wasting my time looking for her here. Thank you for your help." Cat was aware of that bright, curious gaze fixed upon her as she walked back down the stairs, her steps slow and deliberate. It wasn't until she had almost reached the ground floor that she finally heard the click of the old woman's door closing above. Slipping off her half-boots and hugging the wall so that the treads wouldn't creak, Cat darted back up the steps. The lock on Rachel's door was a simple mechanism, easy enough to pick when one has the right training. Cat let herself in and closed the door quietly behind her. Rachel had done well for herself in the 3 short years she'd trodden the boards. The rooms were well-proportioned and richly panelled, the hangings at the windows of draped velvet. But the old woman was right. Where once had stood gleaming polished tables and satin settees were now only small piles of rubbish and other litter strewn here and there. Her bare toes curling away from the cold floorboards, Cat crept softly through the empty, echoing drawing-room and interconnecting dining-room. Rachel's maid had left very little. At the back of the house lay the chamber Rachel had used as her bedroom, its walls covered in a flattering pink silk. It was to this room that Cat now went. Crossing the bare floor, she carefully drew back the heavy drapes and let the fading light of the dying day into the room. Then, her arms at her chest, hugging herself against the cold, she went to stand before the fireplace. The mantel had been cleverly worked, of carved wood painted to resemble marble. Kate studied the fluted pilasters, the scroll-like capitals. She touched first one decorative segment, then the other, pushing, twisting. It has to be here somewhere, she thought, just as a small section of the architrave pulled away from the others. Thrusting her hand into the gaping blackness of the secret nook, she drew out a small book, its gilt-edged pages bound in red leather and tied up with a thong. Rachel's appointment book. Cat checked the compartment again, but it was empty. Untying the leather thong, Cat leafed quickly through the book. She would need to tear out some of the pages, she realized, before she gave the book to Sebastian. It would be too dangerous to let him see anything that might somehow link Rachel back to Leo. Cat could only hope enough would be left to provide Sebastian with some clue to the identity of Rachel's killer. The distant sound of the door from the hall opening brought Cat's head up with a jerk. "Mother Mary," she whispered beneath her breath, and thrust the small book into her reticule. A man's voice came to her, high-pitched and sharp with angry incredulity. "What in the name of God has happened here? I ordered a watch set on this place." Shoving the secret compartment closed, Cat darted through a side door to the back cupboard, off which opened the steep, narrow flight of service stairs. "We left a man here overnight, sir," said another voice, a younger man's voice, at once defensive and conciliatory. "You said nothing about continuing the watch after that." Hopping inelegantly on one foot, Cat slipped on first one boot, then the other, her elbow thumping the stair door back against the wall, as she momentarily lost her balance and wavered. "What was that?" Cat's head jerked around as the urgent, high-pitched words echoed through the empty rooms. "What? I didn't hear anything." The first voice was moving. "There's someone here, in the back, quick!" Cat didn't wait to hear more. Her half-boots clattering on the bare steps, her reticule clutched in her hand. She fled. Chapter 19. The ruse of simple Mr. Simon Taylor from Worcestershire wasn't going to work with a man such as Leo Pierpont. Sebastian and Pierpont didn't exactly move in the same circles, but the émigré knew Lord Devlin on sight, and a poorly cut coat and a few streaks of grey at the temples would be unlikely to prove an adequate disguise. Pierpont had a reputation amongst the ton for shrewdness. So Sebastian visited a discreet shop on the Strand, where he provided himself with a neat little French Cassanière flintlock pistol with a cannon muzzle and stepped breech, which fit snugly into the front pocket of his greatcoat. Then, as an early dusk fell over the city and the lamplighters struggled against a steady rain and sharp January wind, he set off for Half Moon Street. Leo Pierpont hurried down his front steps, his coat collar turned up and hat brim pulled low against the wind-driven rain. "Cavendish Square," he told the hackney driver, shutting the door behind him with a snap. "There are more reasons than one might suppose," said Sebastian, lounging at his ease in the far corner, "for the beau's assertion that gentlemen should avoid riding in hackney carriages." The Frenchman's start of surprise was almost immediately controlled. "I beg your pardon," he said, his glance darting betrayingly to the door. "I didn't realize that Jarvey already had a customer." He had quite a reputation as a swordsman, this Frenchman, his slim body still energetic and agile despite his 40 or 50 years. Sebastian slipped his hand from his pocket and calmly aimed the flintlock at the Frenchman's chest. "I think you understand." Leo Pierpont stretched out his legs, settled deeper into the seat and smiled. "Then I fear you overestimate my powers of imagination." "Yet you know who I am." "Of course." His eyebrows rose in a very Gallic expression of disdain. "Wherever did you find that appalling coat?" Sebastian smiled. "The Rag Fair in Rosemary Lane." "It looks like it. An effective disguise, I suppose, in its way, but only so long as the authorities fail to realize they should be seeking their missing Viscount amongst the ill-dressed, I'm not worried. I suspect you have your own reasons for avoiding the authorities. At least when the topic of conversation is Rachel York. And if your suspicions are incorrect? There is that, of course. Still, it's interesting, don't you think, that you were the man paying the rent on her rooms?" A carriage rattled past, the glow from the torches carried by its link boys slanting in through the hackney window to highlight the Frenchman's sharp, hawkish features. "Who told you that?" Sebastian lifted one shoulder in a careless shrug. "Information is easy enough to come by, when one uses the right means of persuasion." The Frenchman regarded him dispassionately for a moment. "Am I to guess why you've chosen to approach me on this matter?" "I should think the reason obvious." Pierpont opened his eyes wide. "Good God! What are you suggesting? That I killed Rachel? What do you imagine to be my motive, I wonder? Not lust, surely. Given the details you've discovered about our arrangement, it's obvious I could have had the girl any time I chose. Why rape her in a church?" Sebastian studied the other man's carefully composed features. Had Rachel been raped? "Yet you seem to have shared her with others," said Sebastian, keeping his voice deliberately bland. "Was that generosity willing, I wonder? Or not?" "What do you think? That I killed Rachel in a fit of jealous passion?" Pierpont waved one long, delicate hand through the air in a dismissive gesture. "Such a fatiguing emotion, jealousy, apart from being rather primitive and plebeian. You see, I am not a possessive man, my lord. The arrangement Rachel and I had suited us both, however strange some might find it." "There are other reasons to kill." A gust of wind caught the carriage and rattled the glass in the window frame as they turned onto New Bond Street. "There are reasons, yes, but to slit a woman's throat, viciously, repeatedly, until her head is virtually severed from her body. What manner of man does that, You tell me." Pierpont sat silent for a moment, his chin sunk onto his chest, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. "When I was a young man, I watched my father's head roll in the Place de la Concorde. Did you know that a decapitated head remains conscious for some 20 seconds after it is separated from its body? 20 seconds. Think about that. It's a long time, no? Do you think Rachel knew that? That horror. Sebastian listened to the rattle of the carriage wheels over the cobbles, the jingle of the harness. He hadn't known that about Rachel's death either. He thought about that vibrant, beautiful young woman, thought about her alone and afraid in that church, her life's blood ebbing away. "You don't ask, but I'll tell you anyway," said Pierpont, his lips drawing back in a cold, hard smile. "Tuesday night. I hosted at a dinner party attended by some half-dozen highly respectable people who can swear I was at home the entire evening. So you see, my friend, you need to seek elsewhere for Rachel's murderer, if you are not, in fact, he." The hackney slowed, swinging wide into Henrietta Place. Sebastian reached for the door-handle. He didn't doubt the Frenchman knew more than he'd been willing to admit, but they were almost to Cavendish Square, and Sebastian had no desire to be seen there. He was beginning to realize how little he really knew about either Rachel York or her death. He knew she'd been murdered in the Lady Chapel of a small parish church near Westminster Abbey, after telling her maid she was going to meet him, and that one of his pistols had been found tangled in her clothes. But he had only Pierpont's word for it that she'd been raped, and that her throat had been repeatedly, savagely slashed. He didn't even know who had found her, or at what time precisely she had died. These were things he needed to learn, if he were to have any hope of tracking down the real killer. And it occurred to him that he knew someone who might just be able to tell him. Chapter 20. By the time he reached the narrow medieval lane that wound its way around the base of Tower Hill, the wind was blowing in sharp, angry gusts that flapped the wooden signs overhead and sent the rain slashing sideways. In the lee of the deep, crumbling arch of a doorway, his eyes narrowed against the wind-driven rain, Sebastian studied the huddle of old stone buildings opposite. The surgery was dark, but he could see a light burning in the small house beyond it. He cast a quick glance up and down the street. The freezing rain had driven most people indoors. There was no one to see him as he crossed the lane and knocked on the house's weathered front door. A dog barked in the distance. Sebastian heard the thump of uneven footsteps coming down the hall. Then there was silence, and Sebastian knew he was being watched. A wise man did not open his door to strangers at night, even when that man was a surgeon. A bolt slid open, and the door swung inward. The man, who stood just inside the narrow, low-ceilinged hall, was young still, no more than 30, a dark-haired Irishman with a ready smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and brought a roguish dimple to one lean cheek. "Ah, it is you," said Paul Gibson, opening the door wider and stepping back. "I was hoping you might come to me." Sebastian stood where he was. "You've heard what they're saying." "Sure then, but you don't expect me to be believing everything I hear now, do you?" Sebastian laughed and stepped inside. Paul Gibson bolted the door, then led the way back down the passage, the smoothness of his gait marred at each step by a peculiar little half-hitch. He'd been an army surgeon once, even after a cannonball took off the lower part of his left leg. "Come into the kitchen. It's warmer there and closer to the food." Sebastian had bought a paper-wrapped sausage midway through the morning, but he hadn't stopped for lunch, and now it was past dinner time. The fragrant warmth of the kitchen folded itself around him, and he smiled. "Food does sound uncommonly good at the moment." "There are some gentlemen of my acquaintance," said Paul Gibson later, when they were seated at a table before the kitchen fire with a joint of cold ham, a crusty loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine. "They're in the brandy trade, if you know what I mean, and I've no doubt but what they'd be agreeable to—" "No," said Sebastian, reaching for another slice of ham. Paul Gibson paused with his wineglass halfway to his mouth. "No. No. Why does everyone keep trying to introduce me to their friendly neighborhood smuggler?" Sebastian met his friend's arrested gaze. "I'm not running, Paul." Paul Gibson took a deep breath and let it out through pursed lips. "All right. So, how can I help?" "You can tell me what you know about Rachel York's death. Are you the one who did the post-mortem?" In the 2 years since he'd left the army, Paul Gibson had set up a small practice here in the city, but he focused a considerable portion of his time and energy on research and writing and the teaching of medical students, as well as providing the authorities with his expert opinion in criminal cases. "There was no post-mortem." "What?" He shrugged and emptied the last of the wine into Sebastian's glass. "They're not automatically done, you know, and in this instance there wasn't much of a reason for one, really. It was fairly obvious how she'd died." "You saw the body?" "No. A colleague of mine was called in." Lurching to his feet, the Irishman limped across the kitchen to fetch another bottle of wine. It was a brutal attack from the sounds of it. She'd been beaten as well as raped, her throat slashed not once but many times. It fit with what P.2 had told him, but Sebastian had been hoping for more. "Would it be possible for you to arrange to see her?" Gibson shook his head. "Too late. The body's already been turned over for burial. The theatre's arranging it." Sebastian swirled his wine thoughtfully in his glass. "What do you think you're going to do, Gibson swung his wooden leg over the opposite bench to sit down again with an awkward lurch. "Find the man who killed her yourself?" "If I don't, who will? It's not an easy thing, solving a murder." Sebastian looked up to meet his friend's narrowed, worried eyes. "You know what I did in the army." "Yes, but there's a difference, I should think, between being a spy and finding a killer." "Not as much as one might imagine." A hint of a dimple appeared in the Irishman's cheek. "So, have any suspects yet?" Sebastian smiled. "Two, as a matter of fact. There's an actor by the name of Hugh Gordon." "Ah, I saw him just last month. A very effective actor." "That's him. Seems Rachel York was his mistress when she first started at the theatre. He took it badly when she left him." Paul Gibson frowned. "How long ago was this?" "Some 2 years ago." The Irishman shook his head. "Too long. If she'd just left him, I could see it. But passions cool with time." "One might think so, except that he still sounds surprisingly bitter to me. I get the impression Mr. Gordon nourishes Republican sentiments that he believes Rachel York once shared. I'd say he is as bothered by the blue blood of her recent lovers as anything else." The Irishman drained his glass. "So, who is her current lover?" Sebastian reached for the bottle and poured his friend some more wine. "She seems to have been involved with an extraordinary number of gentlemen, at least on a superficial level. But the only one of any significance I've discovered so far is a Frenchman who is paying the rent on her rooms, an émigré by the name of Leo Pierpont." "A Frenchman? That's interesting. What do you know about him?" "Not a lot. He's a man in his late 40s, I'd say. Came back here in 92. He's known as a good swordsman, but I've never heard anything to his discredit." "I put my money on the Frenchman." Sebastian laughed. "That's because it's the French who shot away the bottom half of your leg. Besides, he has an alibi. On the night Rachel was killed, he was giving a dinner party, or so he says. He could be making it up, of course, but it should be easy enough to check." "Unfortunate." Gibson shifted in his seat, a grimace of pain flashing momentarily across his face as he moved his leg. "Neither sounds like a very promising suspect to me. Is that the best you can come up with?" "So far. I was hoping Rachel's body might give me some idea what direction to look in next." Outside, the wind gusted up, buffeting the back of the house and eddying the flames on the hearth. Paul Gibson turned toward the fire, the flickering light playing over the thoughtful planes of his face. After a moment, he opened his mouth to say something, closed it, then finally said in a rush, "You know, there might be a way." Sebastian studied his friend's averted profile. A way to do what? A way that I could get a look at Rachel York's body. Do a thorough autopsy. How's that? We could hire someone to steal the corpse tomorrow night after it's been buried. No, said Sebastian. Gibson swung to face him. I know some men who'd be willing to do it without— No, said Sebastian again. His friend's lips thinned with exasperation. That's done all the time. Ah, yes. £20 for a long, 15 for a half-long, and 8 for a short. A long being a man, a half-long a woman, and a short a child. But just because it happens all the time doesn't mean that I have to do it. The Irishman fixed him with a steady stare. If she were given a choice, which do you think Rachel York would prefer? That her body be left to rot in its grave, or that the man who put her there be brought to justice? Well, we can hardly ask her now, can we? Paul Gibson sat forward, his hands coming up, palms pressed together. Sebastian, think about this. Whoever this man was, he could kill again. In fact, he almost surely will kill again. You know that, don't you? But as long as the authorities are looking for you, they're not going to be doing anything to find him. Sebastian didn't say a word. Gibson flattened his hands on the scarred wooden tabletop and leaned into them. She's dead, Sebastian. The woman who was Rachel York is long gone. What's left is just a shell, a husk that once held her. In a month's time, it'll be rotting pulp. That's simple justification, and you know it. Is it? What we would do to her is no worse than what time will do to her. And there's nothing you can do to stop that. Sebastian took a deep, bitter swallow of his wine. He told himself Paul was right, that catching Rachel's killer was more important than preserving the inviolability of her grave. He told himself her killer could, if free, kill again. But it was still wrong. He raised his gaze to his friends. How soon can you set it up? Paul Gibson let his breath out in a quick huff. The sooner the better. I'll send a message to Jumpin' Jack first thing in the morning. Jumping Jack? The Irishman's dimple flashed, then was gone. Jumpin' Jack Cochrane. A gentleman in the resurrection trade, I have reason to know. I won't ask how you know him. Gibson laughed. He got his name when one of the stiffs he was sliding out of its coffin suddenly sat up and started talking to him. Old Jack jumped out of that grave real fast. You're making that up, said Sebastian. Not a bit of it. The lads he had with him were all for swinging a shovel at the man's head and finishing him off right then and there, but Jack would have none of it. Hauled the fellow off to an apothecary, and even paid the bill when the unlucky devil died anyway. I'm filled with admiration for the man's character, Sebastian said with a grin, and rose to leave. The Irishman's face fell. You're staying, aren't you? Sebastian shook his head. I've put you in enough danger as it is, coming here. I've a room at the Rose and Crown near Tothill Fields. They know me there as Mr. Simon Taylor from Worcestershire. Gibson walked with him to the front door. I'll let you know when everything's arranged. He paused, his face thoughtful, as he watched Sebastian button his scruffy topcoat up under his chin. You do realize, of course, that we could go through all of this and still not learn anything useful. I know it. You're only assuming that the man who killed that poor girl was someone she knew. It might not be, you know. She could simply have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. You might never find who did it. Reaching out, Sebastian paused with his hand on the edge of the door and looked back at his friend. No, but at least I'll have tried. Gibson met his gaze, his face unsmiling and drawn with worry. You could still leave, and spend the rest of my life running? Sebastian shook his head. No. I'm going to clear my name, Paul. even if I have to die trying." "You could die trying and still not succeed." Sebastian settled his hat lower on his forehead and turned into the icy blast of the night. "It's a chance I'm just going to have to take." Chapter 21. Sebastian stood alone in the shadows and watched as Cat Boleyn separated herself from the knot of laughing, pretty women and hot-blooded, predatory males clustered around the stage door. Golden lamplight pooled on gleaming, wet pavement. The wind gusted up, sharp and bitter, and brought with it a rush of smells, of fresh paint and sweat-dampened wool, and the thick grease of cosmetics. Theatre scents, evocative of a time long past when he'd believed, really believed, in so many things, like truth and justice and love. He'd been 21 that summer, not long down from Oxford, and still drunk on the wonders of Plato and Aquinas and Descartes. She'd been barely 17, yet in her own way so much older and wiser than he. He'd fallen hopelessly, wildly in love with her, and he had believed, truly believed, that she loved him. Ah, how he had believed! She'd told him she'd love him until the end of time, and he had believed her, and asked her to marry him. And she had said yes. It was still raining, but softly now. He watched her walk quickly toward him, the hood of her cloak raised against the drizzle, her gaze turned toward the hackney stand at the end of the street. "You should be more careful," said Sebastian, falling into step beside her. "Now is not a good time to be out alone at night." She gave no start of surprise, only glancing up at him from beneath the shadow of her hood. "I refuse to live my life in fear," she said. "I should think you'd remember that about me. Besides," a soft smile touched her lips, "do you think I didn't know you were there?" He thought she probably had. He remembered that about her, too, that while most people were hopelessly, cripplingly blind in the dark, Cat's night vision was unusually sharp. Not as good as Sebastian's own, but sharp. She made a move toward the nearest hackney. He caught her arm, drawing her on up the street. "Let's walk." They turned their steps towards the West End, part of a crowd of playgoers straggling home through the lamp-lit darkness. Snatches of light and laughter tumbled from the quickly closed doors of taverns and coffee-houses, music halls and brothels. From a darkened, urine-drenched doorway, a street-walker hissed at him, her eyes bold, desperate, haunting. Sebastian looked away. "What can you tell me about Leo Pierpont?" he asked. "Pierpont?" The rain had stopped now. Cat pushed back her hood. What is he to do with anything? "He was paying the rent on Rachel's rooms." She was silent for a moment, and he remembered this about her too, the way she carefully thought things through before speaking. "Who told you that?" "Hugh Gordon." Pierpont didn't deny it. "You've spoken with him?" "We shared a hackney ride," said Sebastian, and smiled softly at the familiar way her brows drew together in thought. "It's a curious arrangement, don't you think, for one man to be paying the rent on a woman's rooms, while knowing she continues to receive other male visitors? Unless, of course, he's acting as her pimp." Again that pause, as she thought through what he had said and considered her response. Some men like to watch. Sebastian knew a surge of unexpected and unpleasant emotions. He wanted to ask how she knew this about Pierpont, if she too had entertained the Frenchman by allowing him to watch her make love to other men. Instead he said, "Well, that's certainly one alternative that hadn't occurred to me. Your experience in such matters is more valuable than one might realize." She halted abruptly, her chin jerking up, her eyes flashing. She would have swung away, back toward the theatre, if he hadn't caught her arm. "I'm sorry. That was an unforgivable thing to say." She met his gaze. He couldn't begin to interpret the dark shift of emotions he could see in her eyes. Yes, it was. She removed her arm from his unresisting grip and walked on again. A silence fell between them, filled only with the soft swish of the soles of her half-boots gliding over wet pavement and the whisper of old, old memories. He let his gaze travel over the achingly familiar line of her profile, the arch of her neck. Her nose was small and turned up at the end like a child's, her mouth wide, too wide, her lips full and sensuous. A seductive combination of innocence and sin. There had been other women in his life since Cat Bullin, beautiful, intelligent women, including one in Portugal he might even have fallen in love with if Cat Bullin hadn't always been there, like a shadow across his heart. And he wondered suddenly if he'd approached her this morning because she'd known Rachel York and could give him the information he needed, or if he had turned to her now for some other reason entirely, a reason his mind sheared away from. She said, "You haven't asked if I had a chance to speak with Rachel's maid?" A carriage dashed past, the coronet on its panels glistening with wet, the air filling with the scent of hot pitch from the link boys' torches. Sebastian watched it disappear into the distance, flames wavering against a black sky. "Did you?" "No. She's gone. Vanished, along with virtually everything in Rachel's rooms that was movable." He brought his gaze back to her face. "I thought you said the constables were watching the house." "Only through the night, according to the elderly Scotswoman who lives upstairs. She also told me a young man came to Rachel's rooms the morning after she was killed." "A young man?" "A young man with a key, looking for something, or so it seems. He went through Rachel's rooms, then popped upstairs to ask our inquisitive neighbour if she knew where Mary Grant had gone." "Searching for what, I wonder?" "This, perhaps." Pausing beneath the flickering light of a street lamp, she drew something from her reticule and held it out to him. It was a small book, bound in red calfskin and tied up with a leather thong. "I thought her rooms had been emptied," he said, taking the book and loosening the knot in the leather. "She kept it in a secret compartment in the mantelpiece." She didn't say how she'd known about that compartment. He glanced up at her, then down at the book. It was fairly new, less than a fifth of its pages having been used. And most of those first pages were now missing. "The front pages have been cut out," he said, running one finger along the ragged edges. The clouds overhead shifted fitfully with the wind. The rain had cleared away the city's nearly perpetual blanket of yellow fog, allowing rare glimpses of a distant full moon. In the shimmer of moonlight, her face appeared pale and faintly troubled. "It's almost as if she knew something might happen to her." "Assuming it was Rachel who did it." Sebastian thumbed through the dozen or so pages that were left. They covered little more than the previous week. "You think she was protecting someone?" "I don't know. It seems a reasonable explanation, doesn't it?" There was another explanation, of course, that Cat Bullin had cut the pages out herself. Only, if there had been something here she hadn't wanted Sebastian to know about, why bother to give him the book at all? Why not simply destroy the thing and claim it had never been found? Why even offer to go to Rachel York's rooms in the first place? To keep him from discovering whatever secret had been written on those missing pages? But why? Why? "Have you looked at what's left?" he asked. She nodded. "I've put notations beside the names I recognized. Most of them are people connected in some way with the play." "Any of them have a reason to wish Rachel harm?" "Not that I'm aware of. Besides, we had a performance the night she died. We were all at the theatre." Here was an aspect of Rachel York's murder that hadn't occurred to him. "All of you, except for Rachel. Why wasn't she there?" "Her understudy went on in her place. Rachel sent word at the last minute saying she was ill." "Did she do that often?" "No. I can't think of another instance. Rachel was never ill. Sebastian glanced quickly through the remaining pages. They mainly contained notations for meeting with the likes of hairdressers and seamstresses. But one name appeared on virtually every day. "Who's Giorgio?" "I think it might be Giorgio Donatelli. He helped design and paint the scenery when we did the School for Scandal last year, but he's become increasingly popular as a portrait painter since then. He's had commissions from the Lord Mayor and several members of the Prince of Wales's inner circle. I don't know why Rachel would be seeing him." "What do you know of him?" "Not much, except he's young and rather romantic-looking. He's Italian." "A young man with the key?" "I don't know. It's not like Rachel to give any man the key to her rooms." Sebastian started to put the book in his pocket, but she reached out and touched his arm, stopping him. "You didn't look to see if she'd written down her Tuesday night appointment at St. Matthew of the Fields?" Somewhere in the night a tomcat howled, a deep, throaty caterwaul of primal bestiality. Sebastian met the gaze of the woman beside him. "Did she?" "Yes." There was a ribbon stitched into the binding for use as a place marker. The book opened easily to its last entry. At the top of the left-hand page, in a neat, well-schooled copper plate, Rachel York had written Tuesday, 29th of January, 1811. Sebastian scanned that day's entries. She'd had a lesson with a dancing master at 11 that morning, another appointment near the theatre at 3. Then he saw the words St. Matthew's, and beside that, a name. St. Cyr. Chapter 22. Later that night, alone in his small chamber at the Rose and Crown, Sebastian lit a candle, slipped the leather-bound book from his pocket, and settled down in the room's single, straight-backed wooden chair to read. All the pages containing Rachel's entries prior to the afternoon of Friday, January the 18th, had been cut from the book. Sebastian stared at the date at the top of the first surviving page. It had been bitterly cold that week, he remembered, as he followed Rachel York's fine copper plate through the mundane passage of the last days of her life, through the rehearsals and performances, the lessons and appointments with tradesmen. He leafed through each successive day, scanning the entries, not realizing until he reached the morning of Thursday, the 24th, that another page was missing, the page for Thursday evening, along with the following morning, which must have been on the overleaf of the same page. Thoughtful, Sebastian thumbed back to the beginning. Was there a significance, he wondered, in the pattern of missing pages? What had happened in her life on those 2 successive Friday mornings or Thursday nights that Rachel hadn't wanted anyone to know about? Or that someone else hadn't wanted Sebastian to know? Sebastian returned to the afternoon of Friday the 25th. After that, the pages continued without interruption up to Tuesday the 29th, the evening Rachel died, the evening she had planned to meet someone named St. Cyr in St. Matthew of the Fields. He went back again to that first page, paying more attention this time to each individual entry and to the notations Kat had made beside them in pencil. There was little out of the ordinary, singing lessons and meetings with wardrobe, a reminder to pick up a pair of dancing slippers from the shoe repair man. Each appointment with each individual would need to be checked out, of course, but Sebastian found his attention focusing on 2 names. The painter, Giorgio Donatelli, appeared frequently, each time with only the brief notation Giorgio and a time. But even more intriguing was an individual referred to simply as F. Kat had circled each appearance of the initial, along with a question mark. Once more Sebastian went back to the beginning and ran through the entries. Whoever F was, he or she, appeared in the 12 days covered by the book's surviving pages twice, on the evening of Wednesday the 23rd, and again on Monday the 28th. In other words, Rachel had met with F the evening before the missing Thursday, and again the night before she died. A coincidence? Sebastian wondered, or not. F could be a lover, of course, someone so familiar, so dear, that a simple initial sufficed. But he could also be a person whose involvement in her life Rachel had wanted to keep secret. Why? For the same reason she had kept her appointment book hidden. Conspicuously absent from Rachel's days was the name of the man who had been paying the rent on her rooms, Leo Pierpont. If neither Pierpont nor F had been Rachel York's lover, then who had been? Sebastian found it difficult to believe that such a woman had not had one. Except then, why didn't the lover's name appear in her book? Because she took his regular appearances for granted? Or because his visits were so erratic she never knew when he might appear? A wind had come up, rattling the shutters on the window and causing the flame of the candle to flare, then almost die in a sudden cold draught. A distant burst of laughter sounded, muffled, from the common room below. Out in the hall, a board creaked. Rising quietly from his chair, Sebastian snuffed the candle flame between thumb and forefinger, plunging the room into darkness. Slipping the small French pistol he'd bought that afternoon in the Strand from his greatcoat pocket, he flattened himself against the wall, then reached out to turn the handle and throw open the door to the hall. "Holy hell!" yelped Tom, looking up wide-eyed from where he sat cross-legged on the bare floorboards opposite Sebastian's door. "Don't shoot me!" Sebastian lowered the pistol. "What the devil are you doing here?" In the dim light cast by the oil lamp dangling from a chain at the top of the stairs, the boy's face looked pinched, cold. "For such a sharp cove you can be mortal wet at times. It's watching your back, I am." "My back?" said Sebastian. Tom shrugged. "Well, your jaw at any rate." "Why?" The boy's jaw tightened. "You paid me for a week, you did. I'm earning me wages." Sebastian dropped the flintlock into his coat pocket. "Let me get this straight. You don't see a problem in lifting a stranger's purse, but you refuse to be given wages you don't feel you've earned." "That's right," said Tom, obviously glad to be understood. "I've got me pride." "And a highly original set of principles," said Sebastian. The boy simply looked up at him, puzzled. A gust of wind slammed against the inn, whistling through the eaves and sending an icy draught sluicing down the corridor. Tom shivered, his thin arms creeping around his legs, hugging them closer to his body. Sebastian sighed. "It's a bit draughty out here for conversation. You'd best come in." For a brief instant Tom hesitated. Then he scrambled to his feet. "How did you find me, anyway?" Sebastian asked, closing the door against the cold as the boy scooted across the room to the fire. One bony shoulder lifted in a shrug. "'Tweren't difficult. All I did was ask around till I cottoned on to a young mort named Cat." "You followed me here from Covent Garden?" Tom stretched his chilblain-covered hands out to the glowing coals. A residual shiver racked his thin, ragged frame. "Aye." Sebastian studied the boy's half-averted profile. He was bright and resourceful, and determined, it seemed, to earn his wages. Sebastian thought about all the names and appointments in that little red book, and an idea began to form in his mind. Opening the door to the room's ancient wardrobe, he rummaged around and came up with a quilt and an extra pillow. "Here," he said, tossing the bedding toward the boy. "You can sleep by the fire. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you a room over the stables." Tom caught first the pillow, then the quilt. "You mean you're keeping me on?" "I've decided I can use an associate of your talents." A wide, toothy smile broke across the boy's face. "You won't be sorry, Governor. There won't be any bung-nappers getting their dibs on your Cly or Voggles whilst I'm around, I can tell you that. Nor any trippers up, nor rampsmen thinking you're easy pickings." "Get some sleep," said Sebastian, turning away with a smile. "I have an early assignment for you tomorrow. I'd like you to discover the address of a certain Italian gentleman." "An Italian?" said Tom, in exactly the same tone of voice he might have used had Sebastian divulged a friendship with a cockroach. "That's right. An Italian." Sebastian slipped the pistol from his pocket and placed it, along with his pocketbook, beneath his pillow. "A painter, to be exact. A man by the name of Giorgio Donatelli." The dreams are rarely the same. Sleep and time distort memory. Events become disjointed. Fleetingly glimpsed faces and haunting images recombine with unrelated incidents to torture and taunt. In a mist-shrouded mountain village, simple stone walls rise up scorched and shattered. Reaching out, Sebastian turns over a woman's fly-blown body to find Kat's lifeless blue eyes staring up at him. He cries out, and fresh red blood that seeps from her gashed neck. Her lips move. "Aidez-moi," she says. "Help me. Je suis morte." I am dead. But the knife is in his hand, and he is the one slashing, he is the one killing, and the bloodlust runs hot and sweet through his veins. "Oi, governor, you right there?" Sebastian opened his eyes to find the boy, Tom, sitting up, his thin body silhouetted against the glowing embers of the fire. "I'm fine. It was just a bad dream." Sebastian rolled onto his back, one bent arm coming up to cover his eyes. "Go back to sleep." Chapter 23. The following morning, Sebastian sent the boy off with a full stomach and a suit of warm clothes that included a topcoat and new boots. He half expected the urchin to disappear back into the seething slums from which he'd come. But less than 3 hours later, Tom was back at the Rose and Crown with information that an Italian painter by the name of Giorgio Donatelli could be found at number 32, Almonry Terrace, Westminster. "What's this then?" said Tom, eyeing Sebastian as he wound a roll of padding around and around his torso. Sebastian, who had made another visit that morning to Rosemary Lane and a variety of small shops, pinned the end of the padding and reached for his new, considerably larger shirt. "Today I'm Mr. Silas Beaumont, a plump, prosperous but not particularly well-bred merchant from Handstown, who is interested in having his daughter's portrait painted. While I am discussing the possibility of engaging Mr. Donatelli for this all-important task, you will poke around the area and discover what his neighbours have to say about our friend Giorgio." He balanced a set of spectacles on the end of his nose and affected an earnest, if somewhat vapid, look. "All in the most discreet fashion, of course." Tom sniffed. "Take me for a flat, do you?" "Hardly." By winding 2 cravats around his neck, Sebastian managed to make his neck look twice its normal size. His hair was as grey as an old man's, and the judicious application of theatrical cosmetics had deepened the lines of age on his face. "While you're at it, you might see what you can find out about a woman who used to visit Mr. Donatelli fairly regularly. A young, attractive woman with golden hair. Her name was Rachel York." Tom regarded him through narrowed, thoughtful eyes. "You mean the mort what was cut up in St. Matthew's Church a few nights back?" Sebastian glanced over at the boy in surprise. "That's right." "She the one the bolly dogs think you pushed off?" "If by that impenetrable sentence you're asking if she's the woman the authorities have accused me of killing, then the answer is yes." Sebastian shrugged into his new, very large coat. "You think this Italian cove is the one what did for her?" "I don't know. He might be. Or he might be able to give me some idea as to where else to look." "That's your lay, is it? You figure if you cotton on to the one what did do for this Rachel, then the beaks'll quit hounding you?" "Essentially, yes." "So who else you think might have done for her?" Sebastian, who was rapidly developing a healthy respect for Tom's abilities and powers of perception, gave him a quick rundown of his conversations with Leo Pierpont and Hugh Gordon. Said Tom when Sebastian had finished. Me? I'd put me money on one of them foreigners. You might be right, said Sebastian, reaching for his new walking stick. But I think it best to keep an open mind. The neat 2-story brick building at number 32 Almonry Terrace didn't fit Sebastian's image of a struggling artist's garret. The living quarters occupied the ground floor, while a small hand-lettered sign beside an external stair pointed upward to the studio. Donatelli was doing well indeed for a man who had been painting theatrical scenes just the year before. Sebastian took the stairs with the ponderous effort one might expect of a fat, self-indulgent merchant. At the top of the steps, a door set with uncurtained small panes of glass showed him a large room lit with an unexpected flood of light by an abundance of large windows, all likewise uncurtained. In the centre of the room stood a young man, palette and brush in hand, his posture one of studied thought, as he stared at a large canvas on an easel before him. Sebastian knocked, then knocked again when the young man continued to stare at his canvas. After a third knock, Sebastian simply opened the door and walked into a blast of warm, turpentine and oil-scented air. "Hello there," he said with hearty vulgarity, clapping his hands together in the manner of men coming in from the cold. "I did knock, but nobody answered." The young man swung around, a lock of dark hair falling across his brow as he looked up, distracted. "Yes?" "Romantic," Cat had called him. Sebastian had thought it an odd description at the time, but he understood it now. Tall and broad-shouldered, the Italian was like a handsome shepherd or a troubadour from a Venetian painting of 2 centuries before. Curly chestnut-coloured hair framed a face with large velvet brown eyes, a classical nose, and the full, bowed lips of a Botticelli angel. "I'm looking for a Mr. Giorgio Donatelli," said Sebastian. There were not 1 but 3 braziers burning in the room, he realized. Donatelli obviously missed the warmth of Italy. Already Sebastian was beginning to regret the second neckcloth and the padding around his middle. Reaching out, the painter rested his brush and palette on a nearby table. "I'm Donatelli." "Name is Beaumont." Sebastian puffed out his exaggerated chest and struck a self-important pose. "Silas Beaumont, of the Beaumont Transatlantic Shipping Company." He fixed the artist with an expectant stare. "You've heard of us, of course?" "I believe so," said Donatelli slowly, obviously not willing to risk offending a potential patron with an affront to the man's image of self-importance. "How may I help you?" The artist's English was good, Sebastian noticed, very good, with just enough of an accent to increase that air of romance. He'd obviously been in England a very long time. "Well, it's this way, you see. I was talking to the Lord Mayor the other day about how I was wanting to find someone to paint my daughter Suki's portrait. She's 16 now, my Suki, and anyway, he suggested you." "You needn't have put yourself to the trouble of coming here," said Donatelli, casting an anxious glance around the studio like a housewife flustered to have been caught behind on her cleaning. Sebastian waved away the suggestion with one gloved hand. "I wanted to see some of your work. More than just the 1 or 2 pictures you might choose to trot out for my inspection. Never buy a horse without getting a good look at the stable, I always say." He cast an inquiring eye about the room. "You do have more than this, I hope?" Donatelli reached for a rag to wipe his hands. "Of course. Follow me." Still wiping his hands, he led the way through an open door to a large back room that was virtually empty except for the dozens and dozens of canvases, large and small, propped against the walls. "Aha!" said Sebastian, rubbing his hands together. "This is more like what I was expecting." The painter was good, very good, Sebastian decided, making a slow tour of the room. Rather than the sentimental, flattering formality of a Lawrence or a Reynolds, Here was vigour and iridescence of colour. Sebastian's steps slowed, his respect for the Italian's talent increasing as he studied portraits and sketches, vast dramatic tableaus and small studies. Then he came to a stack of paintings turned against the wall. Curious, he reached for the top canvas. "I don't think that's exactly the sort of thing you're looking for," said Donatelli, starting forward. Sebastian held him off with one outflung hand. He was looking at a painting of Rachel York, not a portrait of Rachel the actress, but a depiction of Rachel as Venus, rising naked and utterly desirable from the sea, her flesh flowing and contoured, and so realistically depicted that one saw the sensuality of a woman rather than the idealized goddess of the myth. "No, but I do like this. It's so very—" Sebastian paused. Erotic was the word that came to mind. He changed it to evocative. Donatelli, who had been watching him with anxious eyes, relaxed. "Hold on," said Sebastian with a sudden pronounced start. He leaned forward as if to study the painting more closely. "Goodness gracious! Isn't she that actress? The one who was recently killed?" "Yes." The word came hissing out on a pained exhalation of air. "Sad business, that." Sebastian shook his head and tutted in the manner of old Mr. Blackadder, the apothecary his father used to call in whenever one of the servants took ill. "Very sad. One has to wonder what the world is coming to these days." He shifted the canvas to one side and found himself staring again at Rachel York, this time as a Turkish odalisque, with one toe dipped in a bath, her only covering a wisp of scarlet satin twining in and out of her bare arms. "I say, there's another painting of her, and another," said Sebastian, shifting more canvases. "And another. She modelled for you frequently, did she?" "Yes. A remarkably beautiful woman," said Sebastian. Donatelli reached out one hand, his fingers hovering just above that vibrant painted face, as if he might caress the cheek of the living, breathing woman herself. His hand shook, and Sebastian, watching him, thought, so he cared for her. But how much? Enough to kill her in a rage of passion? "She was more than beautiful," whispered Donatelli, his fingers curling into a fist as he let his hand fall to his side. Sebastian brought his gaze back to the woman on the canvas. This particular painting was different from the others, the colours a swirling golden riot of greens and blues, with something of Tiepolo's use of sharp shadow accents painted with vigorous gaiety against a wide sunlit sky. Here she sat upon a hillside, bathed in the bright, vibrant light of spring. She had her legs drawn up beneath a flounce of petticoats, her posture almost childlike, her head thrown back, smiling, as if caught in the instant before an outburst of carefree laughter. Sebastian looked down at the image of that vibrant, vital young woman, and he knew an unexpected stirring that was part sadness and part outrage. "She was so young," he said, "so young and full of life." His gaze lifted again to the man beside him. "It seems difficult to imagine how anyone could want her dead." A quiver of emotion, dark and painful to see, passed over the man's handsome, tormented face. "It's an ugly world, with ugly people in it. At least the police seem to know who did it. Some earl's son, is it not? A Lord Devlin?" Donatelli's lips twisted in a savage grimace of hate and bitter, useless rage. "May he rot in hell for all eternity. She knew him, did she?" The painter shook his head. "Not that I was aware of. When I first heard what had happened to her, I thought it was that other one." "That other one?" Donatelli sucked in a shuddering breath that lifted his chest and flared his nostrils wide. "He's been following her for weeks, months maybe, hanging around outside the theatre door, waiting across the street whenever she came here, watching her, Everywhere she went, he was there. She didn't report him? Donatelli shook his head. I wanted her to go to the authorities, but she said it wouldn't do any good. You know what they're like, these aristos. To them we are little better than animals, things to be used and thrown away. The vehemence of his words took Sebastian by surprise. He was remembering what Hugh Gordon had said about heads on pikes and blood running in the gutters, and he wondered if perhaps Gordon was wrong, that Rachel hadn't abandoned her more radical ideas after all, ideas Donatelli obviously shared. "What's his name, this nobleman?" Sebastian asked. He thought for a moment that the artist wasn't going to answer him. Then Donatelli shrugged, his jaw thrust forward in a determined effort to control his emotions, and told him. "You're looking mortal queer," said Tom when they met up at the local tavern for a pint of ale and steak and kidney pies. "What did this Italian cove have to tell you, then?" It seems Rachel York used to model for him. Sebastian pushed through the crowd around the bar and led the way to an empty table in a quiet corner. "So, how did you go on?" Slipping into the opposite bench, Tom wrapped his hands around one of the pies and twitched his shoulder in a careless shrug. "He's a foreigner. People around here don't seem to have much to do with him. Although they noticed the girl all right. She must have been some looker, that Rachel." "She was." Sebastian ate silently for a moment, then said, "Any other women visit his studio frequently?" "Not so's anyone noticed." Tom took a large bite of pie and spoke around it. "Think it was tapping her?" "Possibly, but I'm not sure. Don't talk with your mouth full." Tom swallowed hard, his eyes widening with the effort. "So we didn't learn nothing from all this?" "Oh, we learned something." Sebastian took a deep draught of ale and leaned his shoulders back against the wall. According to our painter friend, a man was following Rachel about for months. A gentleman, to be precise. Tom polished off the last of his pie and set about licking his fingers clean. "Did he tell you this cove's name?" "Yes. His name is Bayard Wilcox." Something in Sebastian's tone caused the boy to stop with his last finger halfway to his mouth. "Know the bloke, do you?" Sebastian drained his tankard and stood up abruptly. "Quite well, as a matter of fact. Bayard is my nephew." Chapter 24. Charles Lord Jarvis paused in the doorway of the princely dressing-room and watched His Royal Highness George, the Prince of Wales, pivot first one way, then the other, as he studied his reflection in the series of ornate, gilt-framed looking-glasses that lined the room's silk-covered walls. Several of the prince's boon companions, Lord Frederick Fairchild among them, lounged at their ease about the cavernous crimson and gold room, their discussions ranging from the use of champagne in boot polish to the newest opera dancers to catch their fancy. A dozen ruined cravats lay scattered across the chamber's richly hued Turkey carpet, while the prince's man hovered at the ready with another armload of starched white linen neckcloths, should the prince's present endeavour be no more successful than the last. Prince George might require the assistance of 2 footmen to shove his corpulent body into his coat, and a mechanical contrivance to hoist him into the saddle, but he always insisted on tying his own cravats. "Ah, there you are, Jarvis," said the prince, looking up. Jarvis, who had spent the past half-hour trying to soothe the wounded dignity of the Russian ambassador, simply bowed and said, "Sir." "What's this Lord Frederick is telling me about Spencer Percival and his damned Tory government pushing for restrictions on our regency?" The prince's full, petulant mouth puckered into a frown. "Restrictions? What restrictions?" Jarvis shifted a crumpled shirt and torn satin waistcoat from a gilded chair shaped like a lotus blossom and sat down. "A temporary restriction only," he said blandly, "to be lifted after 1 year." "A year?" "The doctors insist the king continues to improve," said Lord Frederick, his voice tight with worry. It was the Whigs' greatest fear that mad old King George III might recover before they were able to return to power. There are those in the Commons who are saying a regency may not be necessary after all. "What do you think?" said George, whirling to face his friends. It took Jarvis a moment to realise that the question referred not to his father's health, but to the prince's latest attempt at executing a complicated new knot for his cravat. Sir John Bethany, an ageing roué with full ruddy cheeks and a girth to rival the prince's, hauled out his quizzing glass and subjected his friend to a long, thorough inspection, while the prince waited in an agony of suspense. "Brummel himself could do no better," said Bethany at last, letting the quizzing glass fall. The prince's face broke into a wide smile that collapsed almost at once. "You're just saying that." With an impatient oath he ripped off his latest creation and began again, one eye cocking back toward Jarvis. "Our powers will be the same as the king's, of course?" Jarvis cleared his throat. "Not quite, sir, but you will be allowed to form a government." "I should rather think so," interjected the prince, "although it will need to be announced before you are sworn in by the Privy Council." The prince so often played the buffoon that one tended to forget that the blood of a host of kings, French and Spanish, English and Scottish, from William the Conqueror and Charlemagne to Henry II and Mary Queen of Scots, flowed through this man's veins. He could strike a decidedly kingly pose when he so chose. "Don't start, Jarvis," said George, suddenly every inch the prince. Jarvis inclined his head in a wordless bow. The regal manner faded almost instantly. George sighed. "If only Fox were still with us. Dashed inconsiderate thing to do, dying like that." "Just so," said Jarvis. He waited a moment, then added, "Although Percival thought perhaps—" "The devil fly away with Percival," said the prince in an explosion of warmth. "It's enough to give a man palpitations." He stopped suddenly, the fingers of one hand going anxiously to his opposite wrist. "Our pulse is galloping. The next thing you know we'll be having abdominal spasms." Jarvis rather thought the prince's abdominal spasms could be traced to the mountain of buttered crab he'd consumed the evening before, and the 2 bottles of port with which it had been washed down, but he kept the observation to himself. "It's really far too early in the day for such discussions," said the prince, his hand shifting to the royal belly, a spasm of distress contorting his fleshy features. "It's dangerous for the digestion. I will lie down for a spell." "And your appointment with the Russian ambassador, sir?" The prince looked genuinely puzzled. "What appointment?" "The one scheduled for half an hour ago." "He's still waiting." "Cancel it," said the prince, one hand coming up to shade his eyes as if the light had suddenly become too much. He tottered toward a nearby divan shaped like a crocodile padded with crimson satin. "Do close the drapes, someone. And bring my laudanum. Dr. Herberdon says I must have a dose whenever I feel anxious to avoid any danger of agitation of the blood." His thoughts kept carefully to himself, Jarvis personally went to draw the drapes. Short of the old mad king effecting a miraculous recovery sometime in the next week, the Regency Bill would pass, and this indolent, pleasure-loving, spendthrift prince would be sworn in as regent. But as much as the Prince of Wales might find the image of himself as regent flattering, his experience with the squabbles and intrigues of politics was as limited as his interest. Jarvis was confident that in the end, and given the right set of circumstances, the prince would be only too happy to be guided by others' wisdom. Solicitously turning down the lamps, Jarvis ushered the prince's companions from the room and quietly closed the door. The Whigs might think their long years of political exile were about to end, but men like Lord Frederick Fairchild were too idealistic to anticipate the lengths to which their opponents were willing to go to keep them out of power, and too mealy-mouthed to ever be ruthless themselves. In government, One needed to be ruthless. Ruthless and very, very clever. Sir Henry Lovejoy was looking over case reports at his battered old desk when the Earl of Hendon, a polished walnut box tucked under one arm, walked into Lovejoy's office at Queen Square. Behind him came the sweating, bald-headed clerk, his normally squinty little eyes big and round, over the spectacles he wore pushed down to the end of his nose. "I tried to announce him, Sir Henry, truly I did." Lovejoy waved the man away. "That's all right, Collins." Lovejoy had been expecting an angry confrontation with his fugitive's powerful father. The magistrate had already decided how he would behave, deferential, polite, and respectful, but firm. Standing, he extended one hand toward a nearby chair with worn brown leather upholstery. "Please have a seat, my lord. What may I do for you?" "That won't be necessary." Setting the small wooden case on Lovejoy's desk, he stood with his feet planted wide, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've come to turn myself in." "Turn yourself in, my lord?" Lovejoy shook his head in confusion. "For what?" Hendon looked at him with withering contempt. "Don't be a bloody idiot! For the murder of that actress, Rachel York, of course. I did it. I killed her." Chapter 25. "How old is this nevy of yours?" Tom asked. They were walking along Haymarket. The air was cold, the kind of damp, penetrating cold that sank bone-deep. Wisps of dirty mist drifted across the cobblestones, wrapped round the half-dead plane trees in a small nearby square. By nightfall the yellow fog would be back, thick and pungent and bitter. 20, maybe 21, said Sebastian. "His mother is my elder sister." Tom glanced up at him. "You don't like him much, do you?" He was the kind of little boy who got a kick out of tearing the heads off live turtles. "That and worse." Sebastian shrugged. "I may be prejudiced. He could have grown out of it." "They don't usually," said Tom, his jaws set tight and hard as if to ward off memories too savage to be recalled. And Sebastian wondered again at the life the boy must have led before he'd tried to lift Sebastian's purse in the common room of the Black Hart. A bath, a change of clothes, a few good nights' sleep, and a consistently full belly had wrought a startling transformation in the boy. From what Sebastian had been able to gather, Tom had been alone on the streets for at least 2 years. Of his life before that, the boy seldom spoke. "Why?" Sebastian asked suddenly, his gaze on the boy's sharp-featured, freckled face. "Why in God's name have you decided to throw in your lot with a man in my situation? I can't believe it's for a shilling a day, when you could earn many times that by simply lodging information against me at Bow Street." "I would never do that." "Why not? Many would, perhaps most." The boy looked troubled. "There's lots of bad things happen in this world. Lots of bad things what happen and lots of folks what do bad things. But there's good too. Lots of good. Me mum, before they put her on that ship for Botany Bay, she told me never to forget that. She said that things like honour and justice and love are the most important things in the world, and it's up to each and every one of us to always try to be the best person we can possibly be." Tom looked up, his nearly lashless eyes wide and earnest. "I don't think there's many what really believes in that. But you do." "I don't believe in any of that," Sebastian said, his voice harsh, his soul filled with terror by the admiration he saw shining in the young boy's eyes. "Yes, you do. Only you thinks you shouldn't. That's all." "You're wrong," said Sebastian. But the boy simply smiled and walked on. They turned onto Grange Street, each lost in his own thoughts. Sebastian kept turning over and over in his mind all that he had learned about the woman he stood accused of killing. It seemed to Sebastian that the essence of the woman who had been Rachel York continued to elude him. It was as if each of the men he'd spoken to so far, Gordon, Pierpont, Donatelli, had shed light on a facet of her life only. Sebastian had caught glimpses of Rachel as a new young actress, full of passionate rhetoric about revolution and the rights of man. Of Rachel as a mistress, seductive, compliant. Of Rachel as an artist's model, beautiful and yet ultimately two-dimensional, an image onto which the viewer could project his own fantasies and illusions. Only from Kat had Sebastian picked up a sense of anything beyond that famous face and sensuous body. The Rachel York who'd once been a young child, alone and afraid, and abused by a society that had no care for its weaker or less fortunate members. And yet Kat's rendering, too, had been blurred, incomplete, an image of Rachel as seen from a distance. He needed to see Rachel through the dispassionate eyes of someone who had known intimately all the various aspects of her life, the pattern of her days. What he needed, Sebastian decided, was to talk to that maid, Mary Grant. Stopping abruptly, he swung to face Tom. "I want you to find someone for me. A woman named Mary Grant. She used to be Rachel York's maid, but she cleaned the place out right after her mistress died, so she's probably living pretty high at the moment." Tom nodded. "What does she look like, this Mary Grant?" "I haven't the slightest idea." The boy laughed, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He wasn't just good at this sort of thing, Sebastian was beginning to realize. Tom enjoyed it. "Right then," he said, one hand coming up to anchor his hat to his head. "I'm off. But you watch your back," he called as he dashed away. "You hear?" Kat drew the folds of her black mantle more closely about her and hastened her step. The air was cold and damp, the grey clouds over the rooftops pressing down heavy and low. She should have called a hackney, she decided, just as a man's darkly coated form loomed up before her. She let out a small gasp of surprise, quickly stifled. "This isn't like you, Leo," she said, keeping her voice light. "You must be nervous if you've taken to slinking around London." Leo Pierpont fell into step beside her. "Did you manage to get into Rachel's rooms?" "Last night." "And?" "As you said, there was nothing incriminating." A narrow line appeared between the Frenchman's brows. "You checked the compartment in the bedroom mantel?" "Of course. It contained Rachel's appointment book, nothing more." "You're quite certain you searched everywhere?" "There was nothing else to search. Rachel's maid cleaned the place out, down to the walls." "Her maid?" Something in Leo's tone made Kat look over at him. "What's the woman's name?" "Mary Grant." "Why? What did you think I might find there?" Instead of answering her, he said, "I had an unpleasant conversation last night with your young Vicomte. Somehow or other he's found out I was paying for Rachel's rooms." "Hugh Gordon told him." "Gordon? How the devil could he have known?" "One can only assume he heard it from Rachel." Leo's intense grey eyes narrowed as he searched Kat's face. "He's been in contact with you, has he? Devlin, I mean." Kat shrugged and quickened her pace. "One could say he has a vested interest in discovering who killed Rachel." "And you're helping him?" Leo reached out a hand to touch her shoulder, stopping her. "Be careful, mon ami. He might find out something you'd rather he didn't learn." Kat swung to look up at him. "I'm always careful." A smile quirked up one side of the Frenchman's thin, tight lips. "Except with your heart." Kat stood very still. "Especially with my heart." There were only so many places a young man of Bayard's crowd could be found in London on a cold, foggy January afternoon. Sebastian finally ran his nephew to ground at the Leather Bottle, a tavern near Islington that was popular with cut purses and highwaymen, and the bored, rich young men who liked to rub shoulders with them and learn their thieves' cant, and make-believe for a few gin-soaked hours that their lives had, if not meaning, then at least excitement and challenge. It was early enough that the crowd in the tavern was still thin. A few of the men looked up at Sebastian's entrance, but he had dressed for the part, taking as his model the dashing young gentleman of the highway who had attempted some months back to hold up his carriage one night on Hounslow Heath. Bayard was at the bar, laughing and talking too loudly with 2 or 3 of the gangly, socially maladroit young men with whom he tended to associate. Bayard was very much his father's son, brown-haired and weak-chinned, and already inclined, even at his young age, to run to flesh. Ordering a glass of Blue Ruin, Sebastian leaned in close to his nephew and poked the muzzle of the Cassignard between his ribs. Bayard froze. "That's right," whispered Sebastian, his voice pitched low and rough. "This is a pistol, and it will go off if you do anything, I repeat anything, stupid." Bayard's eyes rolled frantically sideways. "No, don't turn around. And stop looking like you just shit your pants or some such thing. We wouldn't want to alarm your friends now, would we? You need to smile." Bayard gave a sick giggle that came out sounding more like a half-choked hysterical sob. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" "We're going to walk together very slowly to that table over there near the far corner. You're going to sit down first, and I'm going to sit opposite you, and we're going to have a nice little chat." Sebastian reached for his drink, but the muzzle never left Bayard's side. "Walk, Bayard." Bayard walked, his legs trembling and unsteady. "Now, sit." Bayard sat. Sebastian took the rickety, straight-backed chair opposite. The light in the tavern was murky, the few small windows obscured by grime, the tallow dips dim and foul-smelling. A heavy odour of sweat and tobacco and spilled gin filled the air. "Now," said Sebastian, smiling, "you need to try very, very hard not to forget that I have a gun pointed at your crotch." Bayard nodded, his eyes widening as he got a good look at Sebastian for the first time. "Good God, it's you! Whatever are you doing in that rig? You look like a bloody bridal cull." Sebastian smiled. "An appropriate get-up, don't you think, for one in danger of cutting a caper upon nothing?" Sebastian watched, bemused, as Bayard's fear slowly dissipated beneath the onslaught of a deep and powerful fury. "I heard it was you," he said, enunciating the words through clenched teeth. "You, who killed her." "You're forgetting the pistol, Bayard," said Sebastian, as his nephew half rose from the table. Bayard sank back into his chair, his gaze locked on his uncle's face. "Did you do it? Did you? Did you kill Rachel?" "I was going to ask you the same thing." "Me? But I love her." The present tense of the verb wasn't lost on Sebastian. "Besides, it's your flintlock, they're saying, was found on her body. And yet it's you who's been preying on the poor woman since before Christmas." Bayard's eyes widened, that brief flash of anger sliding away as the fear surged again. "Preying on her? What are you saying? I never touched her. Why, I never even managed to summon up the courage to approach her. The one time I found myself face to face with her, I was so overcome I couldn't open my mouth." "You never actually spoke to her?" "No, never." Sebastian leaned back in his seat. "When was the last time you saw her?" Bayard worried his lower lip between his teeth. "Monday night, I think. I went to her performance. But that was all, I swear." "You're sure?" "Yes, of course." Sebastian stared across the table at his nephew. As a child, Bayard had not only been spoiled and cruel, but also dangerously, almost pathologically, untruthful. He wondered how much, if any, the boy had changed. "Where were you Tuesday night?" Bayard might be self-indulgent and weak, but he wasn't stupid. His eyes widened. "You mean the night Rachel was killed?" "That's right." "We planned to spend the evening in Cribb's parlour." He jerked his head toward the 2 men still leaning on the bar, Their attention focused on the mammoth breasts of the woman slinging gin behind the counter.
"Robert and Gil and I. We'd been here, at the Leather Bottle, most of the afternoon, so we were pretty well lit by the time we got there."
"You were there all night?"
"Well, actually, no."
He scrubbed one hand across his face as if to wipe away an unpleasant memory.
"I started feeling unwell."
"You mean you shot the cat?" A deep stain of mortification and resentment coloured the younger man's cheeks.
"All right, yes. Robert and Gil were hauling me out of there when what should we do but run smack up against my father. It was damned embarrassing, I can tell you that. He insisted on taking me home. I must have passed out in the carriage, because the next thing I know I'm in my own bed and he's hauling off my boots and prosing on about how lucky I am that my mother didn't see me."
"What time was that?"
Bayard looked confused. "What time was what?"
"About what time did you pass out?"
Bayard shrugged one shoulder. "I couldn't say for certain. Early. Around 9, I suppose."
Sebastian studied his nephew's red, sulky face. It would take time, but it should be easy enough to trace Bayard's movements through the course of Rachel York's final day, if he were telling the truth.
"Wait a minute,"
Bayard said suddenly, sitting forward.
"I did see Rachel on Tuesday. It must have been about midway through the afternoon when I swung by the theatre on my way here. I was hoping I might get a glimpse of her, and there she was."
"At the theatre?" Sebastian frowned, trying to remember Rachel's schedule for the afternoon before her death. They were rehearsing.
No. She wasn't actually at the theatre, you see. She was in the goldsmith's across the street. I wouldn't even have noticed her except for the way he was shouting."
"He?"
"That actor, you know the one. He was doing Richard III at Covent Garden when it burned down."
"You mean Hugh Gordon?"
"Yes, that's him."
"You're certain?"
said Sebastian, frowning. What was it Hugh Gordon had said at the Green Man?
"I haven't spoken to her for 6 months or more."
Bayard nodded vigorously. "I'd have recognized his voice even if I hadn't seen him."
"They were quarrelling?"
"I don't know about that. But I could see he had her by the arm, and he was leaning into her all threatening-like. I was about ready to go in there and ask him what the devil he thought he was doing, treating a lady that way, when he gave her a little shake and let her go."
"You didn't hear anything he said?"
"Not so as I remember. Except at the very end, right before he turned away, he said—"
Bayard broke off, a strange, arrested expression narrowing his eyes and slackening his jaw. From somewhere at the back of the room came a sharp breaking of glass, followed by an outburst of laughter.
"What?"
said Sebastian, his gaze on his nephew's face.
"What did Gordon say?"
He said he'd make her pay.
Chapter 26. Sir Henry Lovejoy stared at the man who stood in the centre of the office. The Earl of Hendon was built big and powerful, with a barrel-like torso and a thick head, his nose broad and flat in a slab-like, plain-featured face. If there was any resemblance between this man and his son, Lovejoy couldn't see it.
"You, my lord, you're confessing to the murder of Rachel York?" "That's right. She went to that church to meet me."
The Earl fixed Lovejoy with a fierce blue stare, as if he could somehow compel the magistrate to believe him.
"And I killed her."
Lovejoy sat down so fast his chair made a little thumping noise. He had been expecting some kind of trouble from Viscount Devlin's influential father, but never in Lovejoy's wildest imaginings could he have anticipated this. He shook his head, his voice coming out even higher pitched than usual.
"But why?"
It was a question the Earl didn't seem to have expected.
"What do you mean, why? Why did she meet you in St. Matthew's?"
Hendon pressed his lips together and sucked in a deep breath that flared his nostrils and expanded his chest.
"That is none of your damned business. Forgive me, my lord, if you expect me to accept your confession, it is very much my business." Hendon swung away to take a quick turn across the room and back. What the bloody hell do you think I went there to meet her for? He glowered at Lovejoy, heavy eyebrows furrowed, as if daring Lovejoy to disbelieve him. A girl like that? The implications were as inescapable as they were unbelievable. Lovejoy met the Earl's challenging gaze without flinching. In a church, my lord? That's right. Hendon rested his hands flat on the desk and leaned into them. What are you saying? That you don't believe me? Lovejoy sat very still. It was obvious what the Earl was trying to do, of course. This was hardly the first time Lovejoy had been confronted by an anxious father willing to do anything, say anything, to save a beloved son. When it came to a father's love for his child, Lovejoy supposed it made no difference, after all, whether the father was a blacksmith or a peer of the realm. A heavy, sad sigh escaped Lovejoy's chest. There is the matter of Lord Devlin's pistol, which was found on the body. That's just it. It's not Sebastian's pistol. It's mine. Reaching for the wooden box he'd set on the desk, Hendon flipped open the brass clasps and flung back the lid. It was a dueling pistol case, Lovejoy realized, and there, nestled in green baize, lay the mate to the flintlock Constable Maitland had found on Rachel Yorke's body. The moulded cradle for the pistol's twin was conspicuously empty. They were given to me by my father, said Hendon, the fourth Earl, shortly before his death, when I was Viscount Devlin. There was a small engraved brass plate affixed to the front of the box. Lovejoy leaned forward to read it. To my son, Alistair James Sincere, Viscount Devlin. Lovejoy knew a moment of deep disquiet. This proves nothing, he said slowly. You could have given these pistols to your own son at any time these past 10 years or more. My son has his own dueling pistols. The Earl's mouth curled up into a hard smile. As a matter of fact, he was using them the very morning after that girl's murder. So I had heard. Standing up, Lovejoy went to stare out the window overlooking the bare branches of the plane trees in Queen Square below. Not for an instant did he believe Lord Hendon's tale, but if the Earl were to stick to this confession, if he were to insist that he and not his son had perpetrated that savage act of carnage in St. Matthew's on Tuesday night... Abruptly, Lovejoy swung back to face him. Describe for me the disposition of the body. What? Rachel Yorke's body. You say you killed her? You should be able to describe for me precisely how you left her, where she was, what she would have looked like when she was found. Lovejoy watched, fascinated, as the nobleman's face seemed to collapse in upon itself, becoming pale and almost slack with horror, as if he were being forced to look again upon that bloodied, savaged body. She was in the Lady Chapel, Hendon said, his voice hushed, strained. On the altar steps, on her back. She had her knees bent up, and there was blood. He swallowed hard, the muscles of his throat working with the effort. The blood was everywhere. Reaching out, Lovejoy wrapped his hands around the wooden back of his desk chair and gripped it hard. What was she wearing, my lord? A gown. Some satin, I don't remember the colour. Hendon paused. And a pelisse. Velvet, I think. But both were ripped and stained dark with her blood. His eyes squeezed closed as if to block out a horrific vision, and he brought up one clenched hand to press the knuckles against his lips. Lovejoy stared at the man standing across from him. They had been very, very careful to keep the more sordid details of Rachel Yorke's murder from the papers. The only way Hendon could have known these things was if he had seen Rachel Yorke's body himself, or had it described to him by someone who had seen her dead, by the man who had killed her. Lovejoy pulled out his chair and sat down again. You say you had an assignation to meet Miss Yorke at St. Matthew's. That's right. Lovejoy yanked a paper pad toward him and reached for his pen. And for what time was this meeting scheduled?
Hendon didn't even hesitate.
10.
Lovejoy looked up.
10. You're quite certain, my lord? Of course I'm certain. I arrived a few minutes late, but not by much.
Lovejoy set aside his pen and pressed his fingertips together.
So you arrived at St. Matthew's a few minutes after 10, and walked inside to meet her. Is that what you're saying?
Hendon's heavy brows drew together in a puzzled frown.
That's right.
Lovejoy felt a sad, almost pained smile thin his lips.
I'm afraid that's impossible, my lord. Miss York was killed sometime between 5 and 8 o'clock, which is when St. Matthew's of the Fields is locked every evening. What are you talking about?
Lord Hendon's fleshy face turned a dark, angry colour, his voice booming out so loud that he brought the clerk, Collins, scurrying to the door in alarm.
I arranged to meet that woman in St. Matthew's at 10, and the door in the north transept sure as hell wasn't locked when I got there.
Lovejoy held himself very still.
With all due respect, my lord, I believe you are attempting to protect your son by taking the blame for Rachel York's murder yourself.
Reaching across the desk, Lovejoy closed the lid on the dueling pistols case and drew it toward him.
You'll understand our need to keep this, of course. No doubt it shall prove to be a valuable piece of evidence.
Lovejoy hesitated, then said it anyway.
At your son's trial.
Chapter 27. By the time Sebastian reached Cat Bullin's townhouse in Harwick Street, the fog was so thick the street lamps were little more than murky hints of dim light, and the familiar bitter stench of soot choked the cold evening air. It would be a dark night, a good night for smugglers and housebreakers. And grave robbers. He pushed the thought from his mind. His assignation with Jumpin' Jack Cochrane and his crew wasn't until midnight. There was much to do before then. Sebastian lifted the collar of his coat against the damp and studied the house opposite. It was early enough that Cat hadn't left for the theatre yet. He could see her slim, elegant shape silhouetted against the drawing-room drapes, along with the shadow of what looked like a child. Puzzled, Sebastian crossed the street.
I'll announce myself,
he told the thin, mousy-haired maid who answered his knock at the door. He was already taking the stairs to the first floor 2 at a time before the woman had recovered enough to say, "But, sir, you can't do that." He could hear Cat's husky voice even before he reached the drawing-room door.
There's a saying that a good foist must have the same talents as a good surgeon, an eagle's eye, a lady's hand, and a lion's heart. An eagle's eye to ascertain a purse's precise location, a lady's hand to slip lightly, nimbly into the man's clothes, and a lion's heart. She paused, and he could hear the smile in her voice. To fear not the consequences.
Cool. How'd you do that?
Said a voice Sebastian recognized as belonging to his young protégé, Tom. Sebastian could see them now, standing at the far end of the room with their backs to the door. Cat was wearing a black silk gown made high at the neck, with modest crepe sleeves that told him she must have only recently returned from Rachel York's funeral. He couldn't even begin to guess at the reason for Tom's presence.
Now, let's try it again,
she said, handing the boy a small silk purse.
This time, I'll close my eyes while you hide it in one of your pockets.
Try to detect the instant I lift it. She squeezed her eyes shut. Tom tucked the purse deep into his pocket.
Ready?
Leaning against the doorframe, Sebastian watched as Cat brushed past the boy once, then again, extricating the purse from his pocket on the second pass, with deft, practiced skill. She was good, very good. But then, before he'd met her, before she'd become one of Covent Garden's most acclaimed actresses, this is what she had done on the streets of London. This, and other things she rarely talked about.
When you going to lift it?
Said Tom, still waiting patiently. Cat laughed and waved the purse under the boy's nose. Tom's face shone with admiration and delight.
"Blimey, you are good."
"One of the best," said Sebastian, and pushed away from the doorway. Cat swung to face him, an amused smile still curving her full lips. "At least this time you knocked," she said, and he was left wondering if she'd been aware of his presence, of him watching them, all along. He turned to Tom. "I thought you were planning to spend the evening searching for Mary Grant." Tom nodded.
"I figured Miss Cat here might be able to put me onto a few places to look."
Sebastian took off his highwayman's jaunty hat and tossed it onto a nearby chair. "I don't think I'll ask how you progressed from that to pickpocket lessons." The boy ducked his head to hide a grin.
"Well, I'll be off then."
Sebastian watched Tom saunter off, whistling a most improper ditty through his teeth. Beside him, Cat said, "Tom tells me you've hired him as a snapper." Sebastian smiled. "Actually, he's proving useful for a variety of tasks." She tilted her head, looking up at him. "You trust him?" Sebastian met her thoughtful gaze and held it. "You know me? I have a foolishly trusting nature." "I wouldn't have said that." "On the contrary, I'd have said you're an extraordinarily perceptive judge of character." Sebastian lifted one corner of his mouth in an ironic smile and turned away to strip off his greatcoat. "You went to the funeral," he said, tossing the coat and his gloves onto the chair. Cat walked over to the bell pull and gave it a sharp tug. "Yes." He could see the strain of the last few days in her face. She might not have been excessively close to Rachel York, but the young woman's death had obviously shaken Cat, and the funeral had been hard on her. He wondered what she'd say if he knew he had a rendezvous with a group of resurrection men scheduled for midnight. She ordered tea and cakes from the flustered, mousy-haired maid, who appeared stuttering apologies for her failure to properly guard the door. "Hugh Gordon was there," said Cat, when the housemaid had taken herself off. "Was he?" Sebastian stood with his back to the fire, his gaze on the face of the woman he'd once loved to such distraction he thought he couldn't live without her. "That's interesting. How about Leo Pierpont?" She came to settle on a sofa covered in cream and peach-striped silk. "The son of a French comte attend the funeral of a common English actress? Surely you jest." Sebastian smiled. "And Giorgio Donatelli?" "He was there, weeping profusely. I hadn't realized he and Rachel were so close. But then he's Italian. Perhaps he simply cries easily." She leaned her head back against the silk cushions, the flickering light from the candles in their wall sconces shimmering gold over the smooth, bare flesh of her throat as she looked up at him. "Did you have an opportunity to speak to Hugh?" Sebastian wanted to touch her, to run his fingertips down the curve of her neck to her breasts. Instead, he shifted to stare down at the coals glowing on the hearth. The mantel was of white Carrara marble, he'd noticed, the Sèvres vases exquisite, and the oil painting above them looked like a Watteau. Cat had done very well for herself in the past 6 years. And he had survived. "You were right," he said, his voice sounding strained even to himself. "Hugh Gordon is still furious with Rachel for having left him. Perhaps furious enough to kill." "You think he did it?" "I think he's hiding something. He was seen arguing with her near the theatre on the afternoon she was killed." "Do you know what about?" "No, but he said he'd make her pay." Sebastian swung about as the housemaid reappeared at the door, a tray of tea things in her arms. "I'd like to know where he was later that night." "He's doing Hamlet at the Stein." Cat reached for the teapot, "but they're not set to open until this Friday." Sebastian waited until the maid had withdrawn again. Then he said, "I also had the opportunity to make the acquaintance of the painter, Giorgio Donatelli. It seems Rachel was modelling for him." Cat glanced up from pouring the tea. "Nothing ominous there, perhaps, unless she was sleeping with him too." He is a very beautiful man, and Rachel liked beautiful men. Sebastian reached to take the cup from her hand. He was very, very careful not to let his fingers brush hers.
According to Donatelli, Bayard Wilcox has been following Rachel around since before Christmas.
Isn't he your nephew?
Yes, he is. Did she never tell you about it? She did mention once or twice that some nobleman was watching her, although she never told me his name. She tried to laugh it off, but I thought she was being less than honest with herself, that he was making her nervous.
Kat took her own cup into her hands.
Is he capable of such a thing, do you think? A crime of such passion, such violence?
Sebastian brought his cup to his lips and nodded.
Except that he says he was with friends until just before 9 that night, at which point he passed out drunk and had to be carried home by his father.
But you don't believe him? She said it as a statement, not a question.
I learned long ago not to trust anything Bayard tells me, but in this case it should be easy enough to find out if he's telling the truth or not.
Kat sat back, her gaze on the cup she held idle in her lap.
You do realize, of course, that it's possible Rachel didn't know her killer. It could be anyone at all. I don't think so. If she'd been found in the streets or even in her rooms, then I might believe that. But she went to that church on Tuesday specifically to meet someone. I know it wasn't me. So who was it?
It couldn't have been some cousin named Sincere. Sebastian shook his head.
No.
They weren't a family that tended to breed the Sincères. His father had several cousins he disliked intensely, but they all lived up north in Yorkshire or someplace. And it was not a common name.
I keep coming back to that appointment book. Whoever removed those pages did it to prevent something from being known. And yet the book was left so that it could be found. Why?
But the book was hidden.
Yes. Except you knew where to look for it. It's conceivable others could have as well. Pierpont, for instance. He was paying the rent on her rooms. He might very well have a key.
She sat silent for a moment, as if considering this. The woman upstairs described the man she saw the morning after Rachel's death as young.
Pierpont must be almost 50. He could have sent someone.
Kat thrust aside her teacup and stood up.
You think Pierpont killed Rachel?
Sebastian watched her walk over to straighten one of the drapes at the front window.
It was a fussy thing to do, not at all like her. Why not? He was involved with her. For some men, that's all the reason they need, if the woman decides to try to walk away from them, or if she should suddenly become infatuated with a beautiful Italian painter.
Kat turned to face him again. When I was at Rachel's lodging house, the Scotswoman who lives upstairs told me she thought Rachel was planning to leave London.
You think it's true?
I don't know. Rachel certainly never said anything about it. But this woman seems to have the impression Rachel was about to get her hands on a lot of money.
Money?
Sebastian set aside his empty cup.
I wonder if she was blackmailing someone.
Hardly had the words left his mouth when a thought occurred to him. A thought at once inevitable and so terrible as to take his breath. And he knew by the way Kat's eyes flared wide that the possibility had come to her at almost exactly the same time.
"No,"
he said, before she could give voice to it.
"But no,"
he said again, walking up to her.
"You're wrong. I know my father. He might be able to kill, given the right provocation, but not like that. He could never kill like that."
Her head fell back, her wide, beautiful eyes dark and troubled as she looked up into his face. It wasn't simply something Sebastian was saying. He truly believed Hendon could never have raped Rachel York on those altar steps, or left her dying in a sea of her own blood.
And yet
the name Sincere had been there in the dead woman's small red leather book. And the gentleman who'd been stalking her for so many months wasn't only Sebastian's nephew. Bayard Wilcox was also the Earl of Hendon's grandson. Chapter 28. Sebastian met Jumping Jack Cochrane and his two-man crew in a dark byway just off Highfield Lane. A cold wind had come up, tossing the bare branches of the elm trees and silhouetting against a storm-swelled sky the church's spire just visible above the slate roofs of the nearby row of houses.
"Don't keep what you're so feverish to tag along," said Jumping Jack, hawking up a mouthful of spittle that he shot downwind. "'Tain't as if the good doctors have feared we can't be relied on to deliver the goods."
The grave robber was an incredibly tall, lean man, somewhere between 40 and 60, with deep-set, narrowed eyes and raw-boned features, and a good 2 weeks of greying beard grizzling his cheeks and chin. But he was a natty dresser, with a bright red kerchief tied around his neck and striped trousers that showed only a hint of mud round the cuffs. The resurrection business was a lucrative one. Sebastian simply returned the man's quizzical stare and made no attempt to put his reasons into words. This man made his living stealing dead bodies from churchyards. He would never be able to understand the compulsion that had brought Sebastian here, the belief that his responsibility for the desecration of Rachel York's grave somehow obligated him to be there to witness it. They left the resurrection men's cart and horse in the care of one of the lads and set off down a narrowed, darkened alley. They walked softly, their long-handled tools wrapped in sacking to prevent them from clanking together. In a nearby yard, a dog began to bark, deep, throaty howls that blew away with the wind. They kept walking. Rachel York had been laid to rest in the churchyard of St. Stephen's, an ancient sandstone pile that rose up suddenly before them. Hundreds of years of interments had raised the level of its graveyard so far above the street that the swelling soil had to be contained by a stone wall some 3 feet high. And still it bulged out, pestilent, and seemingly filled to bursting. Along the top of the wall ran a high iron fence topped with a menacing row of spikes. But at the end of the alley lay a narrow side gate half overgrown with ivy, which someone had been paid to leave unlocked. The same person had obviously been compensated for oiling the gate's hinges. No telltale squeak shrieked out into the stillness of the night as they slipped quietly inside. A foul stench hung in the air, dank and vaguely, sickeningly sweet. The other men moved as if blind, only risking an occasional flash of their shuttered lantern as they crept through the dark, moonless night. But Sebastian could see almost too well the scattered grey headstones and the looming arches of tombs, the occasional pale glow of a skull or long bone protruding here and there from the muddy earth. The cold night air filled with sounds, the wind rising through the bare branches of the trees, the stealthy, muffled padding of feet on a muddy path, and the hushed, strained breathing of nervous men.
"Here it is,"
whispered Jumping Jack, his lantern flashing for an instant on a mound of naked, freshly turned soil. Unwrapping their tools, the two men set to digging, shovels scraping softly as they sank deeper and deeper into the earth. The stench was stronger here. Lifting his head, Sebastian realized it came from the long, half-filled trench of the poor hole, half lost in the gloomy shadows of the far corner. In the distance, the dog was still barking. From somewhere nearer at hand came the slow, steady drip, drip of water. The thwunk of metal striking wood echoed around the yard. Jumping Jack let out a grunt of satisfaction and said, "Got it." Sebastian forced himself to look down into that dark hole. The resurrection men were experts at their business. Rather than exhuming the entire coffin, they'd simply dug down to the head. Using one of the shovels as a pry, Jumping Jack levered open the top of the casket. Then the young boy with them, a stocky lad of about 16 named Ben, jumped down into the hole. Wheezing a string of curses under his breath, he slowly eased what was left of Rachel York from the coffin, the still, white-clad body showing ghostly pale against the darkness of the turned earth. Squatting down beside the corpse, Jumping Jack slipped a knife from the sheath at his side and began with swift practised strokes to cut away her shroud. Sebastian's hand reached out to grip the man's arm, stopping him. "What are you doing?" Jumping Jack hawked another mouthful of spittle, his pale eyes glittering in the darkness as he spat into the gaping hole beside them. "Ain't no law agin carting a dead body through the streets, but you can win yourself 7 years in Botany Bay if you're caught with a stiff in grave clothes." Sebastian nodded and took a step back. They stripped the body of everything except the band wound lengthwise around her head to hold her jaw closed. Then, leaving the naked body lying in the muddy path, they shoved the grave clothes back into the coffin, closed the lid, and quickly shoveled the earth back onto the empty grave. "You there, Ben," said Jumping Jack, squatting down to grasp the body's bare white shoulders. "Grab her feet." Sebastian collected the shovels and the lantern while the other 2 men lifted the body between them, one bare arm flopping down to drag limply in the mud as they set off toward the gate. From somewhere in the distance came the cry of the watch. 1 o'clock, and all is well. They carried Rachel York's body into the small stone outbuilding behind Paul Gibson's surgery, and laid her on a flat granite slab with drains cut around the outer edges in a way that reminded Sebastian, uncomfortably, of an ancient sacrificial altar he'd once seen in the mountains of Anatolia. He paid Jumpin' Jack £15, which was the going price for a half-long, and more than a good housemaid could earn in a year. As the resurrection men's cart rattled off into the night, Paul Gibson thrust home the bolt on the outside door, then limped over to hang his oil lamp from the chain suspended above the table. Golden light flooded the room, throwing the 2 men's shadows tall and unnaturally thin across the rough plaster of the wall behind them. "Nasty piece of work, this," he said after a moment. Sebastian had to force himself to look down at what lay on the slab before them. Rachel York had been a beautiful woman, her body long-limbed and gracefully made, slim of waist and hip, with full, ripe breasts. Now her soft flesh was deadly pale and smeared with the mud from her grave. But he could see other marks, bruises left by hard fingers digging into her wrists, more bruises on her arms, her cheeks, and ugly slashes across her neck so deep that one might almost imagine her attacker's objective had been to sever her neck. Reaching out, Paul Gibson untied the band around her head, and her jaw fell open. Sebastian looked away. "It would have been better if I could have examined her before she was bathed and laid out and dumped in the mud," Paul said. "Much will have been lost." Sebastian didn't like the way the small, stone-walled outbuilding smelled, or the way it felt. He knew a sudden, driving urge to get away. "How long will it take?" Paul Gibson reached what looked like a butcher's apron and tied it around his neck and waist. "I might be able to tell you something in the morning, although, of course, the full post-mortem will take longer." Sebastian nodded, the smell of death so thick in his nostrils that each breath became a labour. He realised that Paul Gibson was looking at him strangely. "I don't suppose you've heard," said the doctor. "Heard what?" "This afternoon, your father walked into the Queen Square public office and confessed to the murder of Rachel York." Chapter 29. Sebastian had been about 9 years old when he'd begun to realise that there was something different about him, that most people couldn't overhear whispered conversations held in distant rooms, or read the titles of the books on the shelves of the library in the dark of the night, or from across the room. Sometimes he wondered if most people experienced the world around them a little bit differently from their fellows, if the assumption of commonality was simply an illusion. Once he'd met a man who thought a yellow dog was the same colour as the swath of vivid green spring grass in which the dog played, and who swore the grey cloth of his suit was blue. It had been a stray remark made by Sebastian's sister Amanda that had first made Sebastian aware of the fact that most people couldn't see colours at night, that for them darkness reduced the world to a shading of greys through which they moved almost blind. He'd found his ability to see in the dark particularly useful when he'd undertaken the special assignments for the army during the war. He found it useful now as he slipped over the garden wall of St. Cyr House on Grosvenor Square and crept toward the terrace. Alistair St. Cyr, the 5th Earl of Hendon, slept in a massive Tudor tester bed that had once belonged to the 1st Earl's great-grandfather. He came awake slowly, lips pursing in his sleep, eyelids fluttering open, closed. Open. He sat up with a rasping gasp, jaw slack, eyes flaring wide as he took in the clusters of candles burning on the bedside table and along the mantel. His gaze lifted to where Sebastian leaned against the bedpost with his arms folded across his chest, and he let out a sigh of relief. "Sebastian! Thank God! I've been hoping you'd come to me." Sebastian shoved away from the bedpost to stand with his arms at his side, anger thrumming through him. "What the bloody hell did you think you were about, walking into that public office and trying to convince people that you're the one who killed Rachel York?" The expression on Hendon's face was one Sebastian had never seen before, a strange mingling of grief and worry, and what looked very much like guilt. "Because I'm the one she went to meet that night." Tuesday, St. Matthew's, St. Cyr. "Oh, Jesus," whispered Sebastian, one hand coming up to shade his eyes. Hendon thrust aside the bedclothes and stood up, a powerful figure of dignity despite nightshirt and cap. "But I swear to you, she was already dead when I found her." Sebastian huffed a laugh, his hand falling back loosely to his side. "What do you think? That I'm going to believe you've taken to rape and murder in your old age?" Turning, he went to crouch before the fire and stir up the coals on the hearth. He felt the heat fan his cheeks, lick at the graveyard chill left deep within his being. A whirl of disparate, incomprehensible facts suddenly clicked into place, making perfect, awful sense. "So it was your pistol they found," he said, his gaze on the flames before him. A cough rumbled deep in the older man's chest. "I took it with me, just in case. I didn't even realize I'd dropped it until I arrived home and found it missing. I thought about going back, looking for it, but—" He hesitated. "I couldn't bring myself to do it. I guess I was hoping I'd lost it someplace else." Sebastian threw another shovelful of coal on the fire and watched it lay there, dark and smouldering. "And why, precisely, were you meeting Rachel York alone in a Westminster church in the dead of the night?" "I can't tell you that." Sebastian twisted around, one knee pressing into the hearthrug. "You what?" Wordless, his father stared back at him, that strange mingling of emotions shading his brilliant blue eyes. "Was she blackmailing you? Is that it?" "No." Sebastian thrust aside the coal scuttle and stood up. "What else am I to believe?" Hendon scrubbed a hand across his face, his jaw working soundlessly back and forth in the way he had when he was thinking, obviously deciding what he was going to tell Sebastian and what he was going to keep to himself. "She contacted me early Tuesday," he said at last. "She had something she thought I might be interested in purchasing." "So she was blackmailing you?" "No! I told you. She had something to sell. Something I wanted to buy. We agreed upon a price, and she said she'd meet me at St. Matthew's in the Lady Chapel at 10 o'clock. "Why St. Matthew's?" "She said it was quiet. There'd be less chance of our being disturbed or discovered." A round table with a gleaming, well-polished inlaid top stood at the foot of the massive bed, and Hendon went to seat himself in one of the nearby lyre-backed chairs. "That little cross-biting cully of a magistrate, that Lovejoy, he claims the church was locked at 8 that night, but it wasn't.
The north transept door was open when I arrived there, just as she'd said it would be. Did you see anyone else about? No. Hendon's laced fingers tightened until the knuckles showed white. No one. I thought we were alone. She'd lit all the candles on the chapel's altar. I could see the flames flaring up together like a warm golden glow as I walked toward the back of the church. Then I saw her.
He rubbed one splayed hand across his eyes as if to wipe away the memory of what he'd seen.
It was ghastly, the way she'd been left lying there, on the altar steps with her legs spread.
His voice trailed away to a whisper. The effort it took him to push the words out was an almost palpable thing.
You could actually see the bloody imprints of his hands on the bare flesh of her thighs. So much blood, everywhere.
Sebastian gazed across the room at his father's ashen, troubled face.
No one would ever describe the Earl of Hendon as a sensitive man. He was hard, irascible, phlegmatic. He could be brutal.
But he'd never been to war, never seen the blackened, bloated bodies of children lying in the burned ruins of their home, never seen what artillery, or even a couple of drunken soldiers, could do to the once soft, smooth flesh of a woman. Sebastian kept his voice steady, dispassionate.
And this, whatever it was you went there to buy, did she have it on her?
Hendon sucked in a deep breath that lifted his chest, then blew it out again, through pursed lips, and shook his head.
I looked for it.
He pressed a clenched fist against his lips, and Sebastian thought he knew what it must have cost his father to approach that bloodied, ravished body, and systematically, ruthlessly search it.
That must have been when I dropped the pistol. I had hoped I'd left it in the pocket of my greatcoat. I threw it away, you know. The greatcoat, I mean. Stuffed it down one of the drains in Great Peter Street. There was so much blood on it, I could never have explained it to Copeland. I washed off my boots as best I could, but I still had to invent some faradiddle about stopping to help the victims of a carriage accident.
His gaze seemed to come unfocused, as if he was seeing into the past.
So much blood.
Sebastian walked over to stand on the far side of the table, his gaze studying his father's face.
You must tell me what you went there to buy.
Hendon leaned back in his chair, his jaw set hard.
I can't.
Sebastian slammed the open palm of one hand down on the table between them.
Whatever you went to St. Matthew's to buy is very likely the reason Rachel York died. How the bloody hell am I to discover who killed her when you won't even tell me what this is all about? You're wrong. My business with that woman has nothing to do with her murder. You can't know that. Yes, I can.
Sebastian leaned his weight into the tabletop, then shoved himself away.
Bloody hell! Don't you understand what's at stake here?
Hendon pushed to his feet, his face darkening.
You seem to forget who we are, who I am. Do you seriously think I will allow a son of mine to be brought up on murder charges like some common criminal?
Sebastian kept his voice steady.
You can't fix this, father. A woman is dead. An inconsequential whore?
Hendon swiped at the air between them.
Her death I could have dealt with. What I want to know is what the hell you thought you were about, stabbing a constable and leading the authorities on a chase across London. The man slipped and fell against another constable. It wasn't even my knife. That's not what they're saying. They're lying.
Sebastian met his father's gaze and held it. Hendon let out a long sigh.
The constable's not dead yet, but from what I hear it's only a matter of time. You'll need to leave the country until I can sort all this out.
Sebastian smiled.
And Jarvis, you can't tell me the King's very busy cousin isn't behind the authorities' haste to see me arrested.
Sebastian knew from the way his father's jaw worked that he was right. United the two men might be in their hatred of the French, republicanism, and Catholics, but Hendon was far too much a stickler for the preeminence of rules and propriety to ever find favour with a Machiavellian schemer like Jarvis.
"I can take care of Jarvis."
Sebastian pressed his lips together and said nothing.
"I've made arrangements,"
Hendon said, pushing up from the table, "with the captain of a ship. I'm not running." Hendon went to jerk open a small drawer in the bureau on the far side of the bed.
"There's no shame in temporarily removing yourself from harm's way."
The big old house seemed to stretch out around them, painfully familiar, and suddenly, unexpectedly dear in the hushed stillness of the night.
"I'm not running," Sebastian said again. "I'm going to stay here and find out who killed that woman, and why."
Hendon turned, a flash of what might have been fear flaring in his eyes. He hesitated, then thrust out his hand.
"Here. At least take this."
Sebastian glanced down at the banknotes in his father's big, blunt-fingered, outstretched hand.
"I don't need money. Don't be a bloody ass. Of course you need money."
It was true. His various purchases at the rag fair and in Haymarket had seriously depleted his funds, and he would need more in the days to come. He took the money and turned toward the window, only to pause as a thought occurred to him.
"Leo Pierpont claims he was hosting a dinner party the night Rachel York was killed. Can you find out if it's true?" "Pierpont? The French émigré? What the hell's he to do with this?"
"Maybe nothing. Maybe everything."
"Can you find out?"
That expression Sebastian could never quite read was back on his father's face.
"For God's sake, Sebastian, this is madness. If you won't leave the country, then at least lie low until it all blows over. I'll hire the best Bow Street has to offer. They'll track down the real killer. Just concentrate on keeping yourself safe."
Sebastian gave a soft laugh and turned to fling up the sash.
"I'm afraid you'll find that the best of Bow Street is already busy."
He threw one leg over the sill, then paused to glance back at his father's tense, troubled face.
"They're all out there right now, looking for me."
The next morning, the clouds hung low and heavy, and there was a bite to the air that spoke of snow before nightfall. Turning up the collar of his greatcoat against the cold, Sebastian set off on foot toward the city, walking briskly to keep warm. At the base of Tower Hill, he bought a bag of roasted chestnuts from an old woman, then ended up giving most of them away to the small knot of ragged children who huddled nearby, stamping their feet and rubbing their hands in the bitter cold. He knew they'd always been there, these bands of half-starved urchins, just like the desperate mothers clutching their wailing, dying infants, and the homeless, helpless old men and women. Yet it seemed to Sebastian as if he had, somehow, never really noticed them before. Or perhaps it was simply that he had never before walked among them, alone and vulnerable, and sharing their fear.
"You don't look as if you went to bed last night,"
said Paul Gibson, when the surgeon's young maidservant led Sebastian back to the kitchen, where the Irishman was just finishing what looked like a quick breakfast of oatmeal and ale. Sebastian rasped one hand across his unshaven cheek.
"I didn't."
Gibson grinned.
"Neither did I."
He swung his wooden leg awkwardly over the bench and stood up.
"Come see. I've a few things that might interest you."
Following his friend along the weedy path, Sebastian took a last deep breath of cold air and ducked his head to enter the small stone outbuilding that served Gibson as a dissection room. There was a dampness to the room that he didn't remember from before, the dankness accentuating the pungent stench of death and decay.
"I spent a good hour simply washing the mud off her," said Gibson, limping to the body that lay white and cold on the altar-like slab.
Sebastian was glad to see the surgeon hadn't actually started cutting yet. The slices on her neck were made by a two-edged knife, probably a sword stick, such as a gentleman might carry hidden in his cane or walking stick. Sebastian nodded. He had such a walking stick himself, as did Hendon. It was done like this. Gibson demonstrated by slashing his arm through the air, first in one direction, then the other. Your killer cut back and forth, over and over again. He let his arm fall. There must have been a fair amount of blood splattered around that chapel. So I hear. Sebastian studied the savagely hacked flesh of Rachel York's neck, and remembered what his father had said about being so covered in blood he'd had to throw away his greatcoat. Whoever had done this must have walked away from that church drenched in blood. As Leo Pierpont had said, the attack had half severed the head from the neck. And Sebastian was left thinking, how had the Frenchman known that? Because of the way it was done, Gibson was saying, there are slashes running from both the left and the right. But if you look closely, you'll see that the cuts made from left to right are longer and deeper, which tells us that the man you're looking for is right-handed. And fairly strong. Gibson shrugged. She was a small woman. Any reasonably sized man could have overpowered her, although she did fight him. She wanted desperately to live, this woman. With remarkable gentleness, he picked up one of the hands lying so pale and still against the granite slab. Look at how the nails are broken and torn here. And there, he said, pointing. Not only that, but I found traces of skin embedded beneath two of the remaining nails on her right hand. Sebastian glanced up in surprise. You mean... She scratched him. I'd say so, yes. But I suspect it was before he pulled the knife on her. There are no cuts on her hands. Sebastian ran his thoughts back over the men he had spoken to. None had borne signs of having been scratched, at least not in any place that was visible. So she probably scratched him while he was raping her. I'm afraid not. Paul Gibson laid Rachel's hand back down on the cold stone. She was raped after she died, not before. What? How can you be sure? The Irishman leaned over the body. Look at the bruising around her wrists and on her forearms. You can see where she struggled against him, but there's no sign of bruising on her thighs. There would be if he'd been forcing her legs apart, holding her down. Nor is there any bruising on her feminine parts. Only a slight inner abrasion that could have come after death. He swung away to pick up a shallow enamelled basin from the long, low table that stood beneath the small-paned front window. But this is the most telling piece of evidence, he said, and Sebastian found himself staring at a torn piece of satin, now so stained with blood it was impossible to guess at its original colour. Presumably, it's from her dress. I found it inside her. He must have shoved it into her when he entered her. The minor abrasion she suffered from the rape couldn't be the source of all this blood. This blood must be from her throat, which means that by the time he'd mounted her, he'd already killed her. The damp cold of the room was starting to penetrate through the cheap wool of Sebastian's coat. He brought his cupped hands up to his mouth and blew on them, his gaze drifting back to the still form lying on that slab. He was remembering what his father had said about seeing the bloody fingerprints on her bare white thighs, and it hadn't even clicked. Sebastian let his hands fall to his side. So he... what? Struggles with her, bruising her arms and wrists, maybe backhanding her across the face when she scratches him. He pulls a sword from his walking stick, slashes her throat over and over again, killing her. And then he rapes her? Gibson nodded. And picture this. The way he had hacked at her throat, she would have been wet with blood. They both would have been. Sebastian breathed a harsh sigh. My God, what manner of man does such a thing?
A very dangerous one. Gibson set aside the basin with a clatter that rang loudly in the cold room. There's a name for this particular form of depravity. It's called necrophilia. Sebastian brought his gaze back to the savaged, naked body of the woman before them. He'd heard of it, of course. There were places in London that specialized in catering to every sort of vile perversion a man could imagine. Sodomy, sadomasochism, pederasty. And this. So he killed her in order to rape her, Sebastian said. And he thought, what if Kat was right? What if Rachel York was killed by someone who didn't even know her? What if her death had nothing at all to do with who she was, with the men who had moved through her life, or even with the mysterious rendezvous she had scheduled that night with the Earl of Hendon? How could Sebastian hope to find her killer, then? Perhaps, said Paul Gibson. Then again, some men are sexually stimulated by the act of killing. His soft grey eyes grew troubled with the shadow of old, ugly memories, his voice dropping to a pained, torn whisper. As we both know. Sebastian nodded, not meeting his gaze. It was something they'd both seen too many times during the war, the brutal lust of soldiers, still bloody from battle, and turned loose on the hapless women and children of a conquered city, or a farm that simply happened to have the misfortune to lie in the army's path. There was something about the act of killing that could bring out everything primitive and not quite human within a man. Or was that kind of thinking a misconception, Sebastian wondered, born of human arrogance? Because this particular brand of selfishly cruel destructiveness was all too peculiarly human. Many beasts in the wild killed for food, for survival, but there were none who killed for the sadistic sexual pleasure of it. So he could have killed her for some other reason entirely, and found the whole experience so exciting that he felt compelled to ease his lust on her dead body. The doctor nodded. The inner abrasions are slight. He must have already been very excited when he entered her. He hesitated, then said, There is one other thing which may or may not be pertinent. Did you notice the scars on her wrists? Sebastian leaned forward to study the blurred, faded outline of old scars encircling each of her wrists like bracelets. Sebastian had scars like that himself, from his days in Portugal, a legacy of 12 painful, bloody hours spent twisting his wrists against the tight bite of a binding rope. And look at this. Reaching beneath one shoulder, Gibson rolled the body so that Sebastian could see the faint lines of white scars crisscrossing her slim, beautiful back. Someone took a whip to her. How long ago, would you say? I'm not sure. Gibson eased the body back down. At least several years ago, I'd say. He was moving around the room now, assembling instruments on a tray. I might have more to tell you in a day or two, when I've had a chance to do the actual autopsy. Sebastian nodded, his gaze caught by the still, beautiful features of the woman before him. Her skin had been pale, even in life. Now, in the cold morning light, she looked nearly blue, her full lips a surprisingly dark purple. I want to rebury her when you're finished, he said. Gibson came to stand beside him. He had stopped clattering his surgical tools. All right. Sebastian kept his gaze on all that was left of Rachel York. Less than a week ago she had been nothing to him, a name on a playbill, a pretty face only. Even after he'd been accused of her killing, his thoughts had all been for his own survival, his desire to find her killer driven by his own needs, not hers. But at some point in the last few days he realized that had changed. Rachel York had been less than 19 years old when she died, a young woman, alone and defenseless, battling to survive in a society that used and discarded its weak and unfortunate as if they were somehow less than human.
and yet she had stubbornly refused to allow herself to become a victim. She had struggled against the odds, fought back, brave and determined, until some man had cornered her in the Lady Chapel of an ancient deserted church and done this to her. The world was full of ugliness. Sebastian knew that. Ugliness and ugly people. But you couldn't let them win, those men who took what they wanted with never a thought or care for the ones who suffered and died as a result. You could never stop fighting them, never let them think that what they did was right or somehow justified. Never let them triumph unchallenged. "You'll have justice," he whispered, although the woman before him was long past hearing, and he'd lost his belief in an all-knowing, benevolently attentive God long ago, on some battlefield in central Spain. "Whoever did this to you won't get away with it. I swear it." He was suddenly aware of Paul Gibson standing beside him, a strange expression quirking up one corner of his lips. "And here I thought you'd given up believing in either justice or righteous causes." "I have," said Sebastian, turning toward the door. But his friend only smiled. Chapter 30. The snow began before midday. Sebastian walked through crooked medieval streets. Ice filmed over the water standing in the open gutters. A ragged woman hurried past him, her shawl-wrapped shoulders hunched against the weather, her breath white in the cold, dank air. He walked until the smell of the river was thick in his nostrils, and seagulls cried overhead. Beneath his feet, the cobblestones turned slippery with the snow that fell in great wet flakes from out of a yellow-white sky. Cutting between a boarded-up warehouse and a high stone wall, he climbed down a short flight of ancient steps to where the Thames stretched out before him, thick and brown and wide, the wind strong enough now to kick up little whitecaps and fill the air with the scent of the distant sea. Even with the cold and the snow, the river teemed with boats, lighters and culls and barges and hoys, heading downriver to Gravesend and the open sea beyond. It was the lifeblood of the city, this river, and yet how often had he gone through the movements of his days within scant blocks of it, and remained essentially oblivious to its existence for weeks on end. He'd known it was there, of course, yet because it intruded so little on his life, it was easy to ignore, like the distant wailing of hungry children in the night, or the muffled rumble of the parish carts making their early morning rounds, collecting the endless supply of white-wrapped bundles that fed the poor-holes of St. Stephen's and St. Andrew's, St. Pancras, and the Spitalfields churchyard. Easy to ignore, too, was the existence of those dark, unassuming houses in Field Lane and Covent Garden, where for a few coins a man could buy the right to unlock a room and do whatever he liked to the shivering, frightened child or sobbing woman he would find there. Houses where whips cracked and bodies twisted in agony, where there was no hope, no God, only endurance and the ultimate deliverance of death. Whatever perversion a man lusted after, he could buy in this city, for a price. The snow was falling harder now, and faster. Sebastian looked up, letting the small white pellets sting the cold skin of his face. What was becoming a recurrent fear swelled within him, the fear that he was never going to clear himself of this terrible crime of which he'd been accused. And what then, he wondered? What if Rachel York's killing had been nothing more than a random act of violence? What if he could never find the man who had slashed her throat and sated his lust upon her dead, bleeding body? What then of his promise to see justice done, for her and for himself? He told himself her killer must have been someone close to her, someone who knew she would be waiting alone and vulnerable in that church so late at night. And yet Sebastian realized now he'd been wrong, that her killer could simply have seen her in the streets and followed her, watched as she lit the holy candles on the altar, and then come at her out of the darkness, a lethal and intimate stranger. Sebastian rubbed a hand across his eyes, aching now from lack of sleep. After he left his father's house in Grosvenor Square, he'd spent what was left of the night walking the slowly lightening alleys and byways of the city. He kept turning what his father had told him over and over again in his mind, trying to figure out what Rachel York could have been selling that his father would be so desperate to buy that he agreed to meet her in a deserted church in the dark of the night. He'd sworn it wasn't blackmail, but Sebastian had to acknowledge that that could be mere quibbling, a question of semantics only. Whatever it was, Hendon wanted it badly enough that he'd forced himself to overcome his horror and search Rachel York's bloody, mutilated body in hopes of finding it. Yet he hadn't found it, which could mean either that her killer now had it, or that Rachel York had never brought it to St. Matthew's in the first place. Then again, Sebastian couldn't discount the possibility that his father was lying, that Hendon had found it and taken it after all. An unexpected chill shook him. Sebastian turned up his collar against the cold. Hendon's refusal to talk baffled him. After all these hours of walking the streets, of turning over one possibility after another in his mind, Sebastian was still no closer to understanding. It was only now, as he watched the snowflakes falling thick and fast from a lowering sky, that he was able to admit to himself that beneath the confusion and rage coursing through him every time he thought about his interview with his father, what he felt most powerfully was a deep and abiding sense of hurt. For try as he might, he found it impossible to imagine a secret so important that a father would place its preservation above the life and freedom of his only surviving son. That afternoon, Sebastian paid an interesting visit to the small goldsmith shop across the street from Covent Garden Theatre. He was just turning away when he spotted Tom, whittling on a block of wood with a small pocket-knife, as he waited in the protective lee of the theatre's wide porch. "What are you doing here?" said Sebastian, walking up to him.
"Waiting for Miss Cat. She knows someone she reckons might be able to put me onto this Mary Grant's whereabouts, but she figures it'd be better if she were to introduce me to the cove herself."
"Ah," said Sebastian, who knew something of the kind of friends Cat had from her early days in London. Leaning forward, he peered at the quadruped taking shape beneath the boy's nimble fingers. "What is that?"
"A horse," said the boy, proudly holding it aloft.
"Like horses, do you?"
Tom nodded. "I always thought it'd be just grand to be one of them tigers, sitting up behind some sporting gentleman in his curricle, watching him tool a pair of prior my-steppers."
Sebastian personally had little use for the current vogue for employing children as grooms. But as he looked down into the boy's shining eyes, he found himself saying, "Once I fight my way clear of this wretched mess I'm in, I could take you on as a tiger, if you're interested." Tom's eyes narrowed. His face was wary and guarded against disappointment, but his breathing had quickened, his jaw going slack with awe.
"You got a curricle?"
Sebastian laughed and stepped out into the street. "That I do."
"Got a tiger?"
"Not yet." The boy nodded, struggling to contain a grin.
"Where you off to, then?"
Sebastian turned up his collar against the snow. "To have another talk with Hamlet." Chapter 31. Darkness came early that day, settling over the city with a heavy fall of snow. Across the street from the lodging-house where Hugh Gordon had rooms, Sebastian stomped his numb feet and watched the stocky grey-haired woman who came in daily to do for the actor close the street door behind her and set off toward the Strand, the snow blanketing her head and shoulders with white as she hurried through the gathering gloom. Sebastian waited while a coal cart trundled by, followed by a brewer's wagon. Then he crossed the street, with each step easing himself into the persona of Cousin Simon Taylor from Worcestershire. By the time he stood outside Gordon's door, his shoulders had slumped, and he was twisting his hat anxiously in his hands as he waited for Gordon to answer his knock.
"Oh, it's you, is it?"
said the actor, his lips pressing together in annoyance as he cast a distracted glance toward the ornate ormolu clock on his sitting-room mantel. He kept the door open no more than a foot.
"I don't have a great deal of time at the moment."
"It won't take long," said Sebastian, smiling hopefully. Gordon hesitated, then pushed his breath out in a sigh and opened the door wider.
"Very well. What is it?"
"I was wondering if perhaps you could clear up something for me," said Sebastian, scooting through the door. "The thing is, you see, I was speaking with a very kind gentleman who owns the jewellery store across the street from Covent Garden Theatre. You know the place, don't you? The one with the new gas lights? Well, Mr. Toru was telling me, that's the proprietor's name, Mr. Jacob Toru. He was telling me how Rachel was in his shop on the very afternoon she died. But what I find confusing, you see, is that while you told me you hadn't seen Rachel for the better part of 6 months, Mr. Toru says you came in his shop that same afternoon and confronted Rachel." Sebastian fixed the actor with an anxious gaze. "Actually, accosted is the word he used."
Hugh Gordon returned Sebastian's stare with a bland look. Obviously, the man is mistaken.
"Well, one might think so. Except he's a particular fan of yours, is Mr. Toru." Sebastian continued, smiling amicably as he seated himself, without invitation, on a high-backed settee covered in burgundy brocade. "He says he hasn't missed a one of your performances in the past 5 years, and I gather that Cousin Rachel was one of his best customers, if you know what I mean. So, of course, when he read the next day about what had happened to Rachel, he remembered the incident, though I must assure you that he has no intention of telling the authorities about the arguments, or the way you seized Rachel's arm and threatened to kill her." Gordon stood in the middle of his ornate burgundy and lace-draped sitting-room, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as if he were beginning to reassess his attitude toward Rachel's cousin Simon.
"I never did any such thing."
"You're right. I exaggerate. According to Mr. Toru, the precise phrase you used was, 'beat you within an inch of your life.'" The actor was silent for a moment, as if considering whether to continue denying the meeting, or to provide Sebastian with some abbreviated, distorted version of the truth. Abbreviated distortion 1.
"Rachel owed me money,"
he said, swinging away to pour himself a brandy from an ornate tray of heavy gold-rimmed glasses that looked as if it might have been part of the stage props for a production of the Arabian Nights.
"She has owed it to me ever since she first started at the theatre. She wasn't making much in those days, so I provided her with everything she needed in the way of dresses and such. She always knew it was no gift."
"I'm sure you were more than generous with her," said Sebastian, his smile hard. Gordon's brows drew together in an exaggerated frown. Everything about the man was exaggerated, Sebastian decided, from the opulent plush burgundy and gold trappings of his sitting-room to his stentorian speech and theatrical gestures. One of the hazards, one might suppose, of always playing to a large, distant audience.
She used those dresses to sink her avaricious little talons into another man and leave me,
said the actor, his brandy-clutching hand waving expansively through the air.
What would you expect me to do? Just forget it.
You seem to have forgotten it for the better part of 2 years. Gordon shrugged.
A man has expenses.
Sebastian studied the actor's gaunt cheeks and shadowed, preoccupied eyes. It was a look one saw often these days, in the gaming hells and clubs of London, the haunted look of a man who was badly dipped.
What's your poison?
Pharaoh. A wry smile curved the actor's full lips.
Actually, I've chosen hazard as my own particular road to perdition.
Sebastian regarded the other man thoughtfully. Debt had a way of making people desperate, and a desperate man could be a dangerous man.
"There are those who say you've a ready fist," said Sebastian, "when it comes to women."
Gordon drained his drink with one practised flick of the wrist, then pointed a finger at Sebastian over the rim of the empty glass.
"Women like a strong man, a man who knows how to keep them in their place. Don't ever let anyone tell you different."
Sebastian nodded, as if in agreement.
"I can see how a man with a heavy hand might get carried away sometimes. Maybe set out to teach a woman a lesson and end up going too far."
Gordon slammed the empty glass down on a nearby table, his nostrils flaring wide with the quickly indrawn breath.
"What are you suggesting? That I killed Rachel? What kind of a bloody fool do you take me for? Rachel owed me money. When I saw her on Tuesday afternoon, she swore she'd have it to me by Wednesday noon."
He ran one hand through his dark hair, his fingers splaying wide, gripping, his voice dropping suddenly to almost a whisper.
"You can't get money out of a dead woman."
Sebastian was remembering what Kat had told him about the young man who'd been seen letting himself into Rachel's rooms early Wednesday morning. Hugh Gordon was in his mid-30s, but a woman in her 80s would surely describe him as young.
"I'm not so sure about that," said Sebastian. "If you know a woman has money and she's refusing to pay what she owes, you can always go to her rooms and collect the debt yourself, if she's dead."
Gordon let his hand fall.
"Good God! Now I'm a thief as well as a murderer."
Sebastian kept his gaze on the other man's face.
"Where were you Tuesday night?" "I was here, at home, studying my lines." "Alone?" "I work best alone."
He glanced again at the ormolu clock on the mantel.
"Look, I have a performance that starts at 7. We just opened last night, and I need to—"
"Relax."
Sebastian gave the man a slow, mean smile.
"You've plenty of time."
Gordon met Sebastian's steady gaze.
"You're not Rachel's cousin, are you?"
His brows twitched together.
"What are you? Some sort of Bow Street runner?"
Sebastian smiled.
"Something like that."
It was even, in a sense, true, he thought. He was certainly running from Bow Street. Gordon swung away to jerk the burgundy velvet drapes closed against the growing cold.
"She was an unusual woman, Rachel," he said suddenly, one hand still gripping the heavy cloth, as if he were struggling to put his thoughts into words. "There wasn't much she was afraid of. She told me once that fear made a person vulnerable, and she refused to ever be vulnerable again. But I'd noticed lately that she was nervous, jumpy, as if she'd suddenly found herself over her head in something and wasn't quite certain how she was going to get out of it."
Sebastian watched the other man turn away from the window.
"Something like what?" "Actually, I'm beginning to wonder if Rachel wasn't passing information to the French." "The French?"
It was the last thing Sebastian had expected.
"What makes you say that?" "Look at the men she chose."
Hugh Gordon brought his hands up together in a gesture reminiscent of Moses preaching to the masses, and Sebastian knew then that the affectation of a confidence suddenly shared was an act, that whether it was true or not, this was information Hugh Gordon had deliberately decided to impart, probably with a specific intention of deflecting suspicion from himself.
"Usually there's a pattern with women. One will go after men with money, another likes the pretty boys, the dandies and pinks, while another is mad about any man with a title. Not Rachel. The men she selected tended to work in the Foreign Office, like Sir Albert, or they were close to the King, like Lord Grimes. Once she even had an admiral in tow."
Admiral Worth. Sebastian had heard his name, along with that of Sir Albert and Lord Grimes, and others whispered in the streets, As he ran through the names, he realized it was true, that Rachel Yorke's noble lovers shared this one common trait. All were privy to information which could prove very useful if it were to fall into the wrong hands. "You make no secret of having shared Rachel's Republican principles," said Sebastian. "Have the French ever approached you?" He expected angry denials and heated patriotic rhetoric. Instead, Gordon met Sebastian's questioning gaze and said simply, "However much I might wish to see changes here, I'm still an Englishman. I would never betray my own country." "But you think Rachel could?" Gordon lifted one shoulder in a shrug. "Rachel had a lot of anger in her, a lot of hate, both because of the things that had been done to her in her own life and because of what she saw happening to others around her. She spent one afternoon a week working as a volunteer at St. Jude's Foundling Home. Did you know that? She used to say that Napoleon might have betrayed the revolution, but what the French had was still better than what most people have here." Sebastian studied the other man's high-browed, aesthetic face. Hugh Gordon was an actor, a man who made a living out of making people believe a lie. Not for an instant would Sebastian ever trust him, but for all his posturing, his words had a ring of sincerity to them, and that terrible weight of plausibility that can come with an unlooked-for truth. Outside, the wind gusted up, driving a flurry of snow against the window-pane with a violence that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He realized Gordon was watching him with narrowed, assessing eyes. "You don't believe me, do you? Yet you have by now surely verified that what I told you before was true, that Leo Pierpont was paying the rent on Rachel's rooms." "What would you have me believe? That Leo Pierpont acts as Napoleon's agent?" "Nothing as simple as that. Leo Pierpont is what I think they call a spy master." Sebastian pushed to his feet. "Leo Pierpont's family lost everything they owned fleeing the revolution 20 years ago." Gordon gave a tight little smile. "Pierpont fled the revolution and the Republic. But France is no longer a republic now, is it?" The point was well made. The bloody, fervent days of the Republic and the year, too, belonged to the past. Lately, more and more émigré families had been making their peace with France's new emperor, swearing allegiance to the new government of France and reclaiming old estates. Sebastian eyed the other man, assessing. "It's an easy enough accusation to make. Where's your proof? Men as good as Pierpont don't leave proof." "Indeed. Yet the last time I spoke to you, you would have me believe Leo Pierpont was Rachel's lover." Hugh Gordon's smile widened into something at once genuine and vaguely scornful. "Actually, I believe I said the authorities would do well to look into Rachel's association with him. I don't recollect calling him her lover. That was your own assumption."